All right, folks, welcome once again back in the mix. Joshua Brewer here, Joshua City Brewer representing 86 Boxing, of course. And I wanted to get into a bit of the history discussion without a doubt. And the reason behind that is because, of course, we have a lot of the modern content that is going on. We have a lot of modern discussions. We have a lot of people who are speaking on such and keeping up with what's going on in the world of boxing at the current times, I guess you can say. But there are often times where we want to just talk about some of the great fighters of the past because there are plenty of them. Some of them don't get as much shine. Some get a good deal of shine. Some well more than others. You think about the likes of Jack Dempsey. You think about Muhammad Ali. That's even though that's becoming or being a little bit more modern than the likes of a Dempsey or whatever. But that being said, I really enjoy those guys. Even going back further, think about the late 1800s, early 1900s. There's a litany of talent within boxing throughout all of the divisions, to be honest with you. And of course, we didn't have the amount of divisions that we currently have, and therefore, a lot of fighters had to think about what that quest or what that process was going to be like getting to title contention. And some did better than others. There were some fighters who were unable to do a ton. And there were some fighters who drew the color line. There were some fighters who took on all comers, and they suffered the consequences later in life because of the fact that they just fought and fought and fought. And when you think about that, there are really not a ton of fighters who can top the likes of, say, a Sam Langford, the guy that we're going to be having a discussion about tonight. Now, if you followed the channel, you know that I've done a number of videos on top level boxers, top level competition, all of that stuff. And salute to Flack Boxing, says what's good 86. Thank you for dropping in, Flack. That being said, I haven't done anything on Sam Langford. One of the reasons is because he has a very massive career, massive in terms of, if you think about those guys who had hundreds of fights as well as fighting top level competition, it can be hard to boil that down into a single video or a 20-minute video even, which is generally the range of those that I've been releasing as of late. And with that cuts out some things. But in the case of Sam Langford, he had such a high level of competition over the course of his career that you really don't have many spots where you can cut off certain fights or boxers that he faced without pushing out some of the top level competition that he was facing in or around those varying times. But be as it may, this is something that I will eventually do a video on. But when it comes to guys like Sam Langford, I have to employ the services of others. In thinking about that, for this particular video, I reached out to an individual who was a friend of mine who I know has done a lot of work in highlighting the career of one Sam Langford. And this individual has his own channel. He goes by the name of Random Acoustic Thoughts. And if you haven't checked him out, be sure to check him out. But he's going to be joining me here tonight. And the reason behind that is I think that, of course, I could speak about Sam Langford, and I could do him some justice, but I probably couldn't do as good of justice as I feel that Random Acoustic Thoughts could, because I know that he has put in a lot of time and effort to highlighting Sam Langford and his feats over the course of his career, even discovering a Sam Langford fight that hadn't been reported by all of the top boxing record sites, I would say. So with that, I have the pleasure of introducing my man, Random Acoustic Thoughts, holding it down here to join us tonight. And Random, man, it feels good to have you in the house tonight. How's it going, man?
Josh City, what's up, brother? Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It's good to be on your channel. You've come on mine. You've blessed my channel so many times. So here we are.
Yeah. No problem at all. It's all good. I've been it's been cool to get you on for some of the podcasts that I do with Boz, Boxing Chit podcast, but certainly I wanted to at least at some point get you on where we could have a discussion just in general. And that is a cool thing being able to have you here. Who better to talk Sam Langford with than yourself? And as I mentioned, people, go check out his channel. Is at Random Acoustic Thoughts. As a matter of fact, we can drop it in the chat as well. I'll try to do that. I'll try to drop a link to it. But check out Random Acoustic Thoughts because you'll find a ton of stuff on Sam Langford, not just Langford, but some of the other great heavyweights who were rivals of Langford. Think about Harry Wills. I know Random and I, we did a series. I think it's about 5 videos, somewhere in the tune of that, multiple hours of discussions on the career of Harry Wills, one of the great heavyweights of that time, and someone who Sam Langford shared the ring with on many occasions as well. But without further ado, of course, we're going to dive into Sam Langford because I know that's why people are here. So we can have a discussion on him. And of course, it's hard to sum up the career of a man like this in a single video. So we're going to try and give you a little bit of flavor of just about everything. And we'll see where it goes from there. Now, Sam Langford, of course, he was a Canadian, born in Nova Scotia, Canada. And he is certainly one of those guys that makes a case for Canada being one of the most profound and prolific locations or countries in general just for producing boxing talent. So he was born, it was reported March 4th, 1883. As mentioned, Nova Scotia, and like many during that time, made his way down to Boston, Massachusetts, where he applied his trade probably in the most definitive ways he possibly did. But really quick, I wanted to touch on the fact that he did have a brief amateur career, which you seldom saw in those days. But Random, I know that you were familiar with such. It wasn't a ton of fights, but I imagine that helped him to at least start that journey towards boxing because these guys, in Sam Langford being one of them, he turned pro at a very young age.
Yeah, he was in his teens when he started. There was some controversy about when he was born. According to him, he'd said his manager checked it out and it was 1886. So I would put him, it's pretty young when he turns pro, but in 1902, he had 3 amateur fights that I'm aware of. And he won 2 in a night at the Roanoke Club, which was a heavy-duty amateur association or whatever. You know, they put on nights of amateur tournaments. And he won at 135 pounds, 2 fights. The second fight of which was against Jack McVicker or John McVicker or alternately Jay McVicker. I've also seen him reported as Jay McVickers. That's one thing about the newspapers, like getting the names exactly right. Some of these guys you have to sort of interpret. Like he has a fight in 1903 against Jack Johnson, but it's not the Jack Johnson. It's actually Johnny Johnson, otherwise known as Jay Johnson, who was actually the winner of the amateur tournament that Langford won. He won at 145, and they fought the next year. And but Langford had the 3 fights. So the third amateur fight was as a special feature. It was in addition to another tournament, and it was against McVicker. The first time they fought in the finals of the amateur tournament, the 2 major newspapers in Boston, the Post and the Globe, disagreed on who should have got the verdict. Langford got the verdict, but one of the 2 papers said that McVicker made him look like an amateur, not an amateur, but made him look like a novice. He was an amateur, but yeah, made him look like a novice in there. The other guy disagreed, thought the right guy got so the second fight they had, Langford won it, and they actually fought a third time. It turned into Langford's pro debut. They both got suspended by the AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union, for that third fight between them. I guess that maybe they got some money or because it was part of a professional night of fights. I'm not sure which, and that's one of the places where I saw McVicker references McVickers with an S, just one of those times when the names. But when I'm researching Langford, I look for Sam. I also look for misspellings, SAN, SA. Langford, like I look for all variations to try and pick up, and sometimes that's how I'm able to find some things that might slip through a casual digital search. But yeah, so he turns pro that year. in April, but and he has some other fights booked for that year that he doesn't actually have. In his memoirs in 24, in the Halifax Herald, which was syndicated, it's like a 30-something piece, him talking about his early years. And a lot of what we know about his early years is his recollections after 20-something years of being an entertainer. So you take that with a grain of salt. But he said he went up to New Hampshire and he was doing logging again, which is some of the manual labor that he'd done prior to boxing. And then it got cold and he came back down to Boston. And so in January of 1903, that's when the record picks up as far as his career begins in earnest. So technically 02 is his rookie season as a pro, but really 03 is his first full season. And that's when he actually started having meaningful amounts of bouts. Lots of people, you know this, Josh, from looking at BoxRec and some of these places, like even accounting for the fact that not everything gets reported in these days. There are lots of guys who tried their hand at boxing because the money was good and then got right back out when they got their butt kicked and found it wasn't for them. So meaningful fights counts for a lot in this time. A busy schedule does say good things about a fighter if they can be successful, the busy schedule, but really it's the high level opponents, just like today. It's much easier to just churn through journeymen or rookies than it is to fight someone who's like really got a high level of aptitude at the craft. So Langford's career was like that. He fought filler fights. Unlike today, he had a lot of action, like easier fights in between epic fights, even in his prime. But today, a tune-up today might be a high-level fight than some of the guys he fought. But at the same time, his high-level fights were often higher level than guys today have available because there are only so many all-time greats wandering around at any given moment. And he fought in a very rich era for that, as you know. Oh, a big up Rodolfo in the chat too, and Nick.
Good to go. Yeah. Thank you for that, Rodolfo. Shout out to Nick Cameron who dropped by earlier. I know it's he says it's 1:40 a.m. over there in England, so he's crashing for the night. Appreciate you dropping by though, Nick. Of course, always great dialoguing with you. I mentioned Flack Boxing. Shout out to my mom who dropped in the mix as well. Says, hi, son, make it do what it do. I will try and do such. Shout out to Rodolfo Rivera again. Says, what's up, y'all? And also, let's give a shout out to Timothy Tresiocas. I could be butchering that. My apologies there, Timothy. I want to say it's Tresiocas, but he says he's just dropping by since he had to head to sleep in a sec. Nice to see Sam Langford getting some love. Without a doubt, Timothy, well, appreciate you dropping by to even check it out. And we appreciate you knowing Sam Langford, a great fighter, great and amazing career, without a doubt. Timothy also says, man, probably has the wildest and most extensive career in boxing ever. Without a doubt, you know, you don't find many who are in that territory.
I think you can definitely make that argument.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off there, Josh. I just hard agree there with Timothy. I've yet to see a career that was that tough.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Few can even be in that same breath as Sam Langford. Flat Boxing mentions that Random has a great video on the fight between Sam Langford and Joe Gans. Without a doubt, that's one we're definitely going to have to discuss. I know that off air, even Random and we've had a few discussions on that fight at varying times, so we certainly want to get to that one. And then Taro Raymond says, thank you for your knowledge. Hey, appreciate you dropping by, Taro. We appreciate you being here to listen to us do pretty much what you do in terms of just take in and understand, or at least they want to understand and have knowledge of what's going on or what took place back in the history of boxing with those guys who were the early pioneers of the sport, who were critical in the sport being where it is now. And it wouldn't have been the case had not some of these fights and fighters been in the mix back then when they were. So we do appreciate all of you dropping by. We hope you stick with us as we continue to have this discussion. So Random, you mentioned the 1902 season, or the 1902 year, which was pretty much the lightest year for Sam Langford, and then jumping into 1903 when he really started to kick things off. And if you think about it from there, he doesn't really slow down, even when he gets to the point where he's past his prime or whatever. But it was funny you mentioned that McVickers said that he made, or at least one reporter said McVickers made him look like a novice in that amateur fight. Well, I guess technically speaking, he was a novice, you know, and we know what happened later on in his career. So that would mean that he was able to do some pretty good things. So an early challenger, or I guess you can say rival in some sense. And I know you're familiar with them, Random. A lot of people may not be, but Professor Andy Watson, if you look at his record on BoxRec, you're not going to think much of him just seeing the record in itself, but it doesn't take into account all of the no decisions, because this is a guy who had 82 fights, realistically, probably well beyond that. But Professor Andy Watson was someone who was a technical boxer at that time. I've always stated that boxing started well before Jim Corbett from a scientific standpoint. And thinking about that, there were many others who were technical in that sense. But Professor Andy Watson was a first rival of Sam Langford's in some sense. What can you tell me about kind of how that helped to shape Sam Langford as he continued to march forward in 1903?
Yeah, Andy Watson's an interesting character. So I found him. I'm not sure if it's the same Andy Watson, but someone by that name had like a regular theater appearance in the city of Boston. I know he was based in Boston. He rented a hall where he would promote fights as well as participate in them. But prior to that, I found him in the papers in Philadelphia. He got in trouble. He got arrested and charged for running a house of ill repute because they were putting on fights, nights of fights. So he probably had far more fights than you would find on BoxRec. He was a guy, he was about his money, as many were. And one of the ways guys would protect their money is, generally an athletic club or someone would offer a purse, the total amount of money they're going to pay, and then the people haggle out who gets what. Sometimes they'd offer the purse separately to the athlete. Sometimes there's just an amount, and then there's a split for the winner and the loser. A prearranged draw means if you're both on your feet at the end of the fight, the money splits even. That's the way to look at that. It affects the way we see records. And in these times, there were a lot more draws in fights that were scheduled for decision. There were a lot more draws. A close fight often would be ruled a draw. And so in Sam Langford's record, you can look at his win-loss against, say, Hall of Famers or champions. But if you count the draws, there's a huge amount more fights. Not all of them were dead even. Sometimes it was just close enough the ref said, yep, call it good. The money splitting even, the prearranged draw, Langford had one. He actually had several in 1903, but the most famous of them, the most well-known within the niche area of Sam Langford's study, was against Jack Blackburn at the very close of the year. And Blackburn got the best in the majority of rounds. Everyone agreed with that. Newspaper's pretty harsh. So the Boston newspaper proclaimed Blackburn was Langford's master. I mean, it wasn't like home cooking coverage back in these days. You could be praised one fight, the next fight, if you stunk it up, they'd just hammer you and ask if you'd gone back and if you were all washed up. It's really harsh times, but Langford's people insisted on the prearranged draw with Blackburn so that they would get even money and also not get an official loss on his record, because Blackburn was a serious character at this time as well. So you see in Langford's, like in the build-up, now as you know, Josh, he'd already beaten the great Joe Gans over 15 rounds when he fought Blackburn. Mm-hmm. But again, the harshness of the times, that they weren't like, it wasn't like today where if you beat the best fighter in the sport or one of the top 3 fighters in the sport, suddenly you're considered like, hands down, you are great and you can do no wrong. And no, there was still a lot of questions about you, even if you beat someone like Joe Gans, as Blackburn had, although that was over 6 rounds, there were still questions. He was still kind of a prospect, even though he was now a world-class fighter. They didn't know that he was the best guy because you were expected to go fight everybody to prove that. And he'd only started to do that by the end of 1903, even though he'd had 28 fights that year. And you mentioned we found a fight. I found one, a fight against young Jarvis at the Berkeley Bicycle Club, I believe it was, up near Revere, Massachusetts, what's now Revere, Massachusetts, up on the North Shore. But there are probably lots of other fights, because in this time, you know, he was cleaning up, according to him, he was cleaning up the Lenox Club, one of the many athletic clubs in New England, but this is in Boston. He's sparring, you know, stepping as a sparring partner, takes a couple fights, wins amateur tournament, wins another fight, turns pro, goes off to do some manual labor, right? Realizes he still hates that, comes back. Now he's fighting a crazy schedule. These fights are often thrown together very quickly. It wasn't like he planned out a 28-fight season. It's more like he's basically, I think he fought 12 times maybe at the Lenox Club that year. So that's his people. That's where he's based. He was living there for a while until he made some money. Maybe by the end of 03, he would move to Cambridge. But at first, in like 01, 02, he was living in the club as the janitor and the watchman. So he's getting these fights from the club. He's also fighting at the other clubs in the area. And he's also taking fights. Once he starts to build a little bit of a name, he's offered purses to go fight. So he fights Belfield Walcott in Scituate. I think it's in Scituate. Or no, maybe it's in somewhere in Rhode Island. I forget. But a little bit of a travel at this time in New England.
Yeah, you're
20
right.
rounds.
Scituate, Rhode Island.
Okay. Yeah, so he, so he's like, the way to see the schedule is not that he planned out this crazy schedule. It's that he was willing to take on all comers. And even as early as 1903, there are guys that had second thoughts about fighting them. One of his fights with the aforementioned Professor Andy Watson he was supposed to fight George Elbows McFadden, who had been a top lightweight, a real top-notch lightweight, starting to get past it, but still considered a good. He was touted as America's greatest blocker in one of the previews for the fight. But when the night came, McFadden refused to fight him, and he fought a 12-round prearranged draw with Andy Watson instead. Or it was 10 or 12 rounds that night. So
Yeah,
like you see guys are there.
And real quick on that, Random, not to cut you off, I wanted to mention, for those that don't know, Belfield Walcott, that is the brother of the great welterweight Barbados Joe Walcott. Just FYI, I actually found it out. I had seen the name, but I found it out through Random, who had actually done a lot of research into him. So Belfield Walcott, and then he mentioned also Elbows McFadden. We have a video out there on Elbows McFadden on 86 Boxing channel, but definitely one of those guys, for y'all don't know, who was in that pile of greats to never win a world title. I would say often they didn't get shots. Which may have been the case with him, if I recall correctly, but one of those who never won a world title but was highly capable of doing so. And Random is right in terms of a very unique style in the history of the sport, with the ability to block things with his elbows, which is how he got his nickname.
That's right. Also, interestingly, Elbows designed and patented a noiseless speed bag. Awesome. That had like a rim on it that the bag would bounce off of instead of the board above it.
You see, I put folks, that up on one of his Facebook pages. That's why I wanted Random here for this discussion. You see, he's dropping us all these gems and nuggets. You wouldn't have got that from me, but he's got it all packed into his brain right now. He's been in the mix there.
It's a tiny brain, but I try not to clog it up with other stuff. So they did actually fight. So the next year, in 1904, Langford is now fighting at welterweight. He's growing. I mean, he's just a teenage kid when he turns pro. By the next year, he's a lightweight. By the end of the year, he fails to make. I guess I should get into the weights. Okay, so he fights. He's supposed to fight the great Joe Gans, the one of the greatest lightweights of all time, and one of the greatest stylists of that era, like real top notch, like Sweet Pea. That level of like the guy is mythical, and people are learning from him, and later generations like Benny Leonard's like, yo, you thought I was good? You should have seen Joe Gans. That's how good Joe Gans was, that all-time greats call him the guy, like Ali and Sugar Ray Robinson. That's what we're talking about with Joe Gans. So so he was a lightweight champion. I think lightweight might have been 133 in those days, right? The early 1900s.
Yeah.
But they could fight for the title above the weight, and usually it meant the day of weigh-ins, and that would be part of the negotiations. This weight games didn't just start rehydration clauses. Now imagine, who was it? It was Garcia. Who did Garcia just fight with the rehydration clause?
Tank Davis.
Tank Davis, right? Good fighters. They fight at 135, right?
Yep.
All right. So what do you think is hard?
Catchweight. So yeah, they fought at a catchweight of 136.
Okay, so imagine if they had to fight at 138 ringside. Which is harder, cut weight and rehydrate overnight, or fight 138 ringside? So, so in this day, so technically that's at welterweight in this time, but they're contesting for the lightweight world title. Langford couldn't make 138 was my point. He had already kind of outgrown the division. He made 140. It's a non-title fight. The following year, they were booked to rematch for the title. Again, Langford wasn't going to make the weight. Gans fought the New York fighter, young kid Griffo, instead in a challenge match. You know, like he'd give the winner's end of the purse if the guy could last for 10 rounds. And the athletic club would throw in $100 a round past 10. So, you know, again, the format in these years, it was kind of malleable. So you have different, like say a 6-round fight, the danger is different in a 6-round fight than say a 10-round fight or even like a 25, 45 or a finish fight. So some of these guys like Philadelphia Jack O'Brien is an example of a great fighter who fought an incredible schedule, a lot of 6-rounders, fought a who's who, fought across racial lines, was a lot of 6-rounders. So sometimes the longer fights make the difference. Langford in his very first year fought 20 rounds against Belfield Walcott, took a decision. Fought 15 rounds against the great Joe Gans. He also had some shorter bouts, and some of them were draw. Sometimes he would draw with fighters that weren't on a level of the guys he could beat that year. It's how the styles interact over the specifics of the fight. And later in his career, he fought under different versions of boxing. Like in Australia, when he was there, 1911 and 1913, there's no clinching, no holding and hitting. You know, they had more restrictive rules. The same thing in England when he fought in England in 1907, 1909. And I think also when he fought in Paris in 1911, it's more restrictive. Whereas in America, you could do that clinch work most of the time. Depends on the ref. But most of the time you could get away with, and you can see that in the footage of Sam Langford's third fight with Jim Flynn, one of the 3 fights that survived from him. Most of that fight is clinch work. But then if you see the fight against Bill Lang, which happened in England in 1911, there's no clinch work. And you even see Langford, and in the newspapers, you see Langford, they're saying that the danger for American fighters fighting over there, it's so easy to get disqualified. And in fact, when Langford fought Bill Lang, Lang had lost his previous fight by disqualification for hitting the guy when he was down. They didn't play over there. Like your decorum had to be 100% or you get disqualified. So Langford showed, because of his vast early experience against all these different styles and fighting as he grew up year to year, started fighting in a wider circle until 2007 when he made his first trip to England, to London, and beat the pants off of Tiger Smith, a Welsh guy who'd been in the Indian, you know, the British contingent in India, but boxed there in the army. But he spanked him. Then the heavyweight champ, Gunnar Moir at the time, declined to fight him. The winner was supposed to fight Moir. Moir decided, I believe, to wait for Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, who was a huge name, like I said, and a big star. And, you know, part money play, part I don't want to fight Langford. He was too good. Sam Langford was too good, but he fought in a time when there were a lot of badass dudes who didn't care how good someone was. Yeah. So he still fought a crazy schedule, but certain guys thought better of facing him. So that's sort of the paradox of his career is like, can you be avoided and still have a great career? Yes, you can. Can you be avoided and still have the greatest, toughest career? Yes, you can. Sam Langford shows that.
Yeah, and Random, you brought it up, and I think it deserves even more of a look just thinking about it and what it meant at the time and what it means now. But the fact that Sam Langford in 1903, he defeated Joe Gans, who at that particular time had over 150 bouts under his belt. And as you were mentioning, one of the greatest fighters of all time, almost or universally regarded as the greatest lightweight of all time between him and Benny Leonard, and Sam Langford, who was barely a full year into his career, was able to defeat Joe Gans at that particular time, which he was, I believe, 17 at the time or somewhere around there, Random. But I think that alone trumps the career of a number of fighters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a context to everything. So Langford and Gans, I think that was Gans' like 11th or 12th fight of the year, and he had actually fought the night before 6 rounds against Philadelphia's loop-the-loop puncher Dave Hawley. Now, I've been trying to figure out what a loop-the-loop punch is for some time now, like because that was what they called him. But I found an article just 2 days ago describing one of Langford's fights where they were saying he was hitting him from the clinch with loop punches. I think it's like a sideways bolo punch to the back of the head or the side of the head. Like, you know how guys punch in the clinch?
Yeah.
Those real tight hooks. I think that might be a loop punch, like looping over, like under the guy's armpit and then over his own shoulder to punch him in the head. That's just a guess, but I'm going to keep working on that. But anyway, Dave Holly was a really clever fighter. He fought a ridiculous schedule. I mean, I'm pretty sure he had over 30 fights in 1903.
No, yeah.
And then he fought and he beat Langford in 1904 in their first fight. He gave Langford his only loss of 1904. And Langford's, as you know, Langford's 1904 was ridiculous. So to be the only guy to get a W from him, I think Langford had 14 fights. So Dave Holly was special, but he had fought 6 fierce rounds against Gans the very night before. And like Gans was like playing cards and drinking, took the train and lost over 15 rounds to Langford. But we don't have to feel bad for Joe Gans because he did stuff like that all the time, because this is what certain guys did. The guys who could handle that schedule, there was tremendous money in challenge matches, fighting in private, side bets, all kinds of stuff. And Gans made a huge pile of money, but he fought busily, but not as busy as Langford. And Langford had back-to-back fights on back-to-back nights that year as well, just not that night. So there is a context to like Gans. It was just widely thought that he just underestimated Langford, but Langford had made a name for himself, and Boston was a major market for boxing. So he didn't have an excuse to take him lightly. It's just that he knew how good he was, and he was so experienced. I mean, he had well over 100 wins.
Oh, yeah.
Well over 100 wins already. So Langford was just one more guy that he was going to spank, because he had done that so many times. He'd go just traveling around. All these hot guys who were having good seasons, he'd go around and beat them for a side bet in the purse. And his manager, Al Hereford, was plugged in with the, let me think, was it the Eureka Athletic Club in Baltimore? He also managed young Peter Jackson, who Langford fought a series with. Young Peter Jackson actually beat Langford the same year that Jack Johnson beat him. He stopped him. It was a TKO, injury TKO, but that was the very next fight after. In 1906, Langford fought Jack Johnson, then he fought young Peter Jackson, although he avenged the loss by the end of the year.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That was the great thing about that time. These guys fought series. Langford had so many series. You could keep stats on. I think they used to joke about that, keeping stats like almost like baseball, because he had some of these guys, he fought them so many times, and not just the main rivalries, lots of different dudes.
Yeah, it's
like
almost,
we mentioned Andy Watson, young Peter Jackson,
an unbelievable
Dave Holly.
schedule there, Random. It's just almost unbelievable. You mentioned that 1904. Just think about this: Jack Blackburn, Belfield Walcott, who he faced. Of course, Jack Blackburn the first. Willie Lewis, an underrated fighter out of Philadelphia. I believe he's out of Philadelphia, who was a title contender from the time. I did a video.
He was an excellent fighter. He went to Paris too. He fought in Europe.
Yeah.
Serious
gave
dude.
Harry Lewis a run for his money in their rivalry. Then Dave Holly, who you mentioned, one of these guys who doesn't get mentioned often, but is one of the great fighters of that time, who had the resume and the work to back it up. But he also faced Barbados Joe Walcott. This is all 1904. Just think about the implications of him fighting those types of individuals in 1904, which is, from a technical standpoint, or just thinking about it from just his fight schedule standpoint, really his second year as a pro, and he's already going up against guys of that ilk. And the Walcott fights, I know, was billed as a world welterweight title fight. And I think that just speaks volumes to the level of Langford, considering that many probably associate him with the heavyweight division these days.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And part of why, the discussion is like any one weight class, like where does Langford rate all time? He makes probably the best argument at middle, light, heavy, and heavy, depending on someone's criteria. But like at these lower weights, he didn't spend a long time, so he doesn't have the resume. So even though he beat Gans that year, even though he spanked Elbows McFadden, like when he finally fought Elbows McFadden in 1904, the most reliable source I can find, that is to say something that describes the actual action, and they were on the ground, like the reporter was there live, because there's a lot of repeats. But you see information start to stray from the accuracy. Like I saw one of one of the reports on Langford Gans said that Langford was fighting as a light heavyweight. I'm like, well, you weren't there. You know, you just repeated something. You got a typo. You weren't thinking about it. But anyway, like McFadden only landed 2 light punches in the whole fight. He almost got finished in the first, saved by the bell, knocked back onto his shoulders, out, unconscious for 2 minutes. So, like, you know, I guess it was good that he shouldn't have ducked him the year before, because Langford grew in that time. But Langford didn't spend long as a lightweight. That was 1903. The first 4/5 of 1903, he was a lightweight. He was a welterweight until 1904. By 1905, he might have been able to cut to welter, because contrary to what people think, fighters did cut to make weight then. It's just they didn't do as much damage, because oftentimes, you know, if you're fighting ringside, or I've seen negotiations, do they weigh in at 3 p.m. or 6 p.m.? But if they're fighting at, say, 9 or 10 p.m., you don't have time to do a scientific rehydration. You just eat and drink, and, you know, and that's it. And then you go in and fight. So the dynamics of weight cutting were a lot different, but there were guys who were good at stripping down the pounds. I see discussions that in the paper. Yeah. Hold on, we got a good comment here. What's this? I've always wondered why Langford and Harry Greb never squared off. Part of that was, by the time Greb was fighting at heavyweight, Langford was long past his best, and he also fought sometimes out of the U.S. At that time in his later years. But also, you know, Langford was still feared, and he was just such a brick shithouse of a physique, even as an old blind guy. There was no real like benefit to fighting him, but also Langford was a full-blown heavyweight, but even though he's short, so he was far outside of Greb's weight, and just not a good matchup. You know, a guy that Greb wouldn't be able to hurt him. You could try and outpoint him, but you know, it's really like, it wasn't like when Langford was in a middleweight fighting heavyweights. Like Greb was like a finesse and speed and creativity. He couldn't thump with the power hitting heavyweights. Langford was feared for his power. Even Dempsey didn't want any part of an old Langford.
Yeah, that's a very good point there, Random. And we had another comment from Darkman. Salute Darkman, and salute to the user who mentioned that actual comment as well. But Darkman was mentioned, I wonder if Langford and Greb happened in private for rich guys, only just like Greb versus Dempsey did. Yeah, you know, I had mentioned Random that there were a ton of fights that did happen sort of in private and all that stuff. And we know these guys from back then, a good deal of them, especially those the likes of Langford and others who had a crazy pace that has already been reported on. We know they probably, in all likelihood, had a number of other fights behind closed doors. I hadn't heard anything of a Greb Langford one, but that's certainly one that would have been a salivating matchup, you know, here in hindsight when we think about those two. But that being said, I do think Random makes a very good point in terms of just kind of how things were going for them career-wise and trajectory-wise at that particular time. Yeah, Langford was certainly, once he made that jump to heavyweight full-fledged, he was a handful, and he was able to carry his power. In the case of Dempsey, as Random mentioned as well, or not Dempsey, but Harry Greb, rather, he wasn't one of those guys who had a lot of knockouts. So he often had to do it boxing, using that finesse, speed, footwork, being on the outside, jumping in and out, as mentioned. Very intriguing matchup, just thinking about it overall. But Langford is one of those guys legendarily known to carry his power up to heavyweight, thumping larger men. And I think that is probably the most glaring thing that stands out when thinking about him and Harry Greb. I just wanted to throw that out there as well, Random. And shout out to the Butcher of Texas as well, who actually dropped in, sent some big kudos. Buchero of North Texas, actually, the best boxing channel. Salute, we appreciate you, Butcher, without a doubt. And then Flat Boxing, Random, he mentions one of the fights with Fireman Jim Flynn. Sam Langford did almost a cartwheel and nailed him with an uppercut after he landed his cartwheel. Yeah, Langford was something else. Very special fighter, I think.
That's a wonderful moment.
He said.
And unlike today, just briefly touching your glove to the thing didn't stop the action. Mm-hmm. No one was hit down. He didn't even slip. Mm-hmm. He just did a little cut. I don't think you could use that as a regular technique, but as it was incidental, they just kept fighting, which was nice. You know, they just, the flow of action was a little different in those days. You see prolonged clinching, holding and hitting, like holding behind the head to hold the head in place in the hitting, kidney punches, You see Flynn leading with his head. Looks like he nails him with a pretty hard headbutt at one point,
Yeah.
like an uppercut, an upper butt, whatever you would call it. But yeah, so, but then like they couldn't fight that way in the UK at that time. It would be the opposite. Flynn would have no chance whatsoever because he couldn't. He wanted to come in close. Interestingly, when Fireman Jim Flynn knocked out Jack Dempsey
Mm-hmm.
in the first round, he did it with a technique he learned from Sam Langford,
Yeah.
using the right to load up the left. I think to load up the left hook, like that turn of the shoulders when you plant the right. I think to the belly. I'm not sure if he hit him with the belly of the face, but I saw a newspaper report where Flynn said, "Yeah, I picked up that trick from Sam Langford."
Oh yeah, not
So there you
surprising.
go. So
Not
and that's
surprising there,
that's his
Random.
greatest win.
And yeah, and that's an interesting one right there, of course, because just thinking about that fight, not to derail discussion going on, but certainly Dempsey, he was knocked out, and I also read reporting where some were mentioning that it wasn't a knockout, probably because of the fact that his brother stepped in, from what I understand, to stop the fight pretty much after this took place, and it was pretty evident that Dipsy wasn't going to be able to continue. So I've seen it used as a means for saying that, hey, he wasn't officially knocked out per se, but that's
I've
just one
seen
of the
people say that
nuances
as
there.
well. The solution to that, like I found, like because there's so much boxing is such a storied, and what would the term be, mythologized sport, that there's often a wide gap between the myth and the talking points that persevere compared to like what actually happened. So I found the most detailed report of the fight that I could find. I think it was the Salt Lake Journal or whatever it was. It was like the newspaper. They were obviously on the ground. They had all the action, all the lead up, the delay in the fight going on, everything that happened. He was very clearly out. Like he got floored. He just rushed in. He got floored. And you see Dempsey in his rise. They booked him for a lot of 4-rounders, a lot of shorter bouts, so Dempsey could unload on the guy. And if you can't get him out of there, you'll probably get him on points. But fight before you gas, go load up. Not every fighter is brought up the same way. So Dempsey, they probably learned from that. And I took it a little easier with him, like find ways to bring him up to his full capabilities because he was great. But like everybody, there's a learning curve. Langford didn't go undefeated either. He lost. He lost in spirit to Jack Blackburn and Andy Watson, but in actuality to Danny Dwayne in New York lightweight in 1903. He lost to Dave Holly in 1904. He lost to Larry Temple and Joe Jeanette in 1905. Langford's the thing, though, is between 1902 and 1917, he only had 2 defeats that went unavenged. That would be Danny Dwayne, who retired, and Langford outgrew lightweight anyway. And then Jack Johnson. He avenged every other defeat. He got a win over everyone who beat him from his debut through 1917 when Fred Fulton beat him. He never got that one back across their 2 fights.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Hey, it happens, especially when you fight such a tough schedule. I know Greb wasn't able to get, I believe, Michael Dow is who it was, who wouldn't fight him again. Don't quote me on it. I believe it's O'Dowd, though, but I could be wrong. But yeah, that's,
No,
sometimes
that's
it's
right.
like
Mike
that.
O'Dowd,
Okay,
another good
cool.
fighter. Sometimes people get a taste. Even when they win, they don't necessarily want to go
Yeah.
back at it. I think that might have been a newspaper decision, a no decision fight. So if it was somewhat up in the air, so that's another thing too. I'd seen not everyone was like this, but Greb, apparently sometimes he fought different. He fought more furiously when the fight was for a decision. I think it
No,
was
yeah.
Tommy Gibbons said that, or one of them, it was Gibbons or Tunney said that the difference between fighting Greb in a no decision state and fighting him to a decision was dramatic. But
Oh,
I haven't
yeah.
seen other people say that, so it might have just been that one guy's experience. You can't read too much into any one source to try and get an accurate picture. Same way with how these fights are described. We distill it down to win-loss records, but we know from recent results, there are a lot of close fights.
Yeah.
It's not like a win is green and a loss is red, and that's just an absolute line. There's differences in fights. There are close fights, or there are even like clear winners where neither guy gets hurt or gets really into the mix. Then there are
Yeah.
wide decisions where both guys are going to the hospital. Like it's clear who won, but both guys get jacked up in the fight. Like there's no, And it's just like this in these times. In Langford, sometimes he had close fights with guys who never had the success of some of Langford's actual victims.
Oh,
Just
yeah.
the way they lined up. But you don't see that when fighters are protected. Langford he wasn't protected, but he was, like with the prearranged draw against Blackburn. At times, his management did. There were actually complaints in one of his fights with Blackburn that his manager was shouting instructions from the corner during the fight.
Mm-hmm.
It was ticking off the ref. So like he was brought up. Like Joe Woodman, the guy who was representing him in the Lennox Club, you know, he had people behind him. He wasn't like floating around. He was trained by George Byers, who'd been the colored middleweight and heavyweight champion.
Oh, yeah.
Who was old by then, but in fight years, not in he wasn't actually old, but he was like old for the fight game. That's something else that's changed. You can be a 30-year-old prospect now.
All right.
And maybe it's happened before in the past, but it's very rare. It wasn't like by age. Oh, what was the fight I was looking at the other day? It was two guys. They were both 25, and they had such a ridiculous amount of fights already. I just can't remember quite who it was. But Langford, you know, like he had, as far as his pro career, I mean, he had at least 29 fights by the end of his second season. And one of those seasons only had one fight in it. So you think about like some of today's great fighters, great talents like Lomachenko, you know, that's like the other extreme version of that, where very talented, very few fights as a professional, but lots of amateur experience. Langford wanted that money, and winning a watch for winning a tournament is not the same as getting a purse and being a pro. So he went pro very quick. And so these early years, his rise involves so much adversity because, again, he's fighting a pro. He's not fighting 2-minute rounds. He's not fighting with these big, nice padded gloves. You know, he fought as late as 1911. The first time he fought the great Sam McVeigh, California heavyweight, another great, very popular in France. They fought in Paris, 20 rounds to a draw. He was about just over 160. McVeigh was just over 200 for the fight. They were both in peak shape. 4-ounce gloves, 20 rounds.
Crazy.
4-ounce gloves, 20 rounds. 4-ounce gloves is what MMA gloves weigh.
Mm-hmm.
And he's given up 40 pounds. And he's not giving up 40 pounds where he's 200, the other guy's 240. He's 160. Now, that's not walking around chubby at 160. That's absolutely trained to fight one of the best heavyweights in the world, who turned out to be one of the great heavyweights. So, I mean, that's not a normal 160. That's an absolutely rip-cut, stocky 160. But Langford's chest and shoulders, and they were of mythical proportions. Like the reporting, by the time he hit his prime, the way he was described, certain writers would even treat it as it was unfair because he was built like that.
Yeah.
Because his arms were so long and his chest was so barrel shaped, and that his shoulders were so broad and his head was so flat, and he was just so designed to punch people that it wasn't fair.
Yeah, that's
and that the white guys should avoid him.
Yeah, there's a little newspaper promo reel out there of him just kind of showing his strict in that way. I know it's one that you've shown before. There isn't a ton of video out there on Langford, but there is one where he's kind of going back and forth with the guy, just using one arm to push him off, just in a sense to show that, hey, don't let the size fool you. This guy was strong enough to inflict damage on any opponent, even if they had several inches on him in height and reach and several pounds on him. So the thought of him fighting McVeigh, giving up that amount of weight, and the fact that McVeigh was a huge puncher, the Mike Tyson of his time, in some sense, just shows you that Sam Langford was just, he was built different, for lack of better words, and that kind of alludes to what you're saying, just some proportions that were a bit different and off by comparison to the average person who would be around his height, which is about 5'7", some argue 5'6" plus. But generally in that range for the most part. But this was a guy who was one of those legendary kind of once in a lifetime type of fighters. And I think that kind of is what makes him unique as a fighter as well.
Yeah, and circumstance robbed him of his full opportunity because his heavyweight prime overlapped with Jack Johnson's world title reign, where Johnson was getting a little bit past his prime physically, not skill-wise, physically, and was taking easier fights because he was he was basically doing what every heavyweight champ did, which is cash in, make all the appearances, and live it up because you're the top sports star in the world. And you know, at that time, there was a lot of money to be made outside of the top opponents. But I've seen a report where when one writer was saying that Langford Johnson would draw almost as much as the Jeffries fight. Like, it might not be quite as large, but it would draw close because it was what the sports fans wanted. Even the racist sports fans wanted to see the best fighters fight each other. Some of the writers were a bit like protective because they had their own thing going, but they were like writing for the general public as well, pandering to the racists. But the sports fans, the bettors, they wanted the top fights, just like today.
Yeah, and
they didn't care. They didn't like, and it wasn't like, oh, I'm nervous around black people, so I just want the white guys to fight each other. No, that was structurally, people saw profit in that later, but it was the fans were, and the writers for the most part were hardcore. Give us the best fights. Stop making excuses. It's just an excuse.
And really quick in that regard, Random, and I'm going to step away for about 1 minute and I'm going to be right back. But I know you'll be able to kind of show this and explain this in a way that people understand. But you're right. That would have been a huge draw here in the United States. But not only that, in France and Australia, it might have even been a bigger draw. I just wanted you to touch on just how influential fighters like Sam Langford, Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, etc., those that fought during that particular time, how influential they were to the boxing scene in Australia and France, particularly the heavyweight scene, which was huge.
Yeah, absolutely, brother. So at different times, they were fighting over in Europe where they could get a little bit more acceptance, where it wasn't that it wasn't overtly racist over there, but it wasn't as stacked up against him structurally. So Langford, when he was having trouble earlier in his career getting fights, there were times when he went over the west coast of the US. He was based in Boston. He lived in Cambridge, which is just right next to the city of Boston. They're directly next to each other. And but he had to go to England to get fights, and then he got to England. He did too well against Tiger Smith, and I think it was Thorne, the other guy he fought. I think he might have beaten another guy after the Smith fight, and so he came back to the States. And then later in his career, he's having trouble getting fights on the East Coast, so he goes out to the West Coast. This also happened with Joe Jeanette, who I think was from New Jersey, and then Sam McVeigh from California. So McVeigh, one of his nicknames was the Idol of Paris. That's how popular he was in France. And he not only did, appearances and was a celebrity there, but also, fought there. But he also did like mixed rules, at least one mixed rules fight. He fought a English chap who went by a Japanese name, but he was a student of a jiu-jitsu master. I don't think the guy himself was that good, but McVeigh knocked him out with a punch. But they were having a little mixed rules action going on there. So the spectacle, like as far as wrestling, the fight that I found for Langford again in 1903, this is a bit of a derail, but the fight I found for Langford in 1903 against Young Jarvis, that same night at the bicycle club there, they had Greco-Roman wrestling bout. They also had I can't remember what they called the other version, whether it's freestyle or whatever, but they had two different styles of wrestling bouts that same night that they had boxing. They also had a talk and sang some songs together. But like to get back on the thing, all three of these fighters were wildly popular with the sports fans. There were big purses offered for them, and in the writers, it became evident that Langford, Jeanette, and McVeigh and Johnson were the four best heavyweights on the planet. No one else could beat them. They could only beat each other. But the frustration was that Johnson wasn't fighting them. He was fighting the other guys, which was drawing attention, but it wasn't the top fights. It was the attention fights, but the top fights, that was what Langford, McVeigh, and Jeanette were doing. And the other guys were mixing in with them, but in large part, other than a few little upsets here and there, they would spank everybody and then fight each other, and then they could beat each other. Like McVeigh so Jim Flynn edged a newspaper decision over Langford in 1910, 5 weeks before losing badly to him in a scheduled 45 rounder in California again. But
Legit
45. I think it went to
45.
7 or 8. Scheduled for 45. So that's a big money fight. So Langford, they thought he might have carried him in the first fight because he had already stopped him with ease in the first in 1908. So 5 weeks later, he did stop him. Although the footage of that fight exists and is actually, they're both doing work. It's just that, like, Flynn's doing work. It's just Langford's so good from the clinch. Now, that drill you mentioned, Josh, that he's doing, that's George Byers. And then it looks like Bob Armstrong is the first guy, former colored heavyweight champ, part of his camp. It's the first guy he's doing that drill with. And then George Byers jumps in. He's a little pudgy by that time, but you see George Byers in the footage in the ring walk when they walk out in the footage with Bill Lang as well. He's like he's wearing the suspenders. But anyway, that drill, you see Langford use that in the Jim Flynn fight. When Flynn is coming battling forward, right, trying to fight inside, Langford's posting off with one arm, chambering, like winding up those giant uppercuts and then hitting him, but then using that to switch stance. So now the hitting hand is now the posting hand, and then he's going to hit him with the uppercut with the other hand. He's doing sort of this dance of destruction with his long arms and his low head, and there's nothing Flynn could do. And I just want to relate that to a fantasy matchup. If you think Sam Langford couldn't do that to someone like Rocky Marciano, who had really short arms, you got to think again, people. Like, that matchup, Rocky's destructive power, yes. His whole thing is to get inside. A guy who can do that, who has a reach that's bizarrely long compared to where his head is, it's really hard to get inside on. And that's why practically nobody fought Langford coming forward, even a knockout artist like Sam McVeigh. And McVeigh had knocked out guys Langford had fought and beat them easier than Langford did. But when it was time to fight Langford, he fought on the retreat, because Langford had that kind of power and he had that kind of range control, and he could punch just like Jack Blackburn wanted Joe Louis to get. He could punch from any distance. He could punch from 6 inches away. Some of his knockouts, one of his knockouts of Tony Ross, they said it was like a 4-inch punch, and that most of the crowd didn't even see it. It was so quick. Like, that's how hard he hit. And that's another reason, like, later in his career, once he was a heavy guy, he didn't have his mobility anymore, but he was a hitter. So there were guys who wouldn't want to fight him because what are you going to do to him? Like, certain guys like Tiger Flowers, great fighter, volume fighter, southpaw. He was doing the volume, right? Then Langford he got him out of there. He read what he was doing, even though he could barely see. He was blind in one eye, almost blind in the other eye, but he knew so much. He'd seen so much. And he had such a chin on him, that he got him out of there. That was the power he had. And that explains why a lot of guys wouldn't even fight a fat, old, half-blind Sam Langford.
And that's funny.
Because if you don't have the style...
Yeah, not to cut you off, but that's funny because that that transcends generations in a sense. If you think about Tiger Flowers and when he came to prominence as the world middleweight champion, and the fact that Sam Langford was able to fight and defeat Tiger Flowers, that just shows you the longevity of his career, and then just overall just the sheer number of top level fighters that he was up in the ring against. That's pretty crazy to think about him facing Tiger Flowers.
Yeah, and stopped Big George Godfrey, the Leaperville Shadow. The
Insane.
Second George Godfrey, not the original Canadian George Godfrey, who was a little dude who could hit he was a tough character himself. He had one of those great mustaches too.
Oh yeah, he did. That is definitely good stuff. And Random, real quick, I want to shout out Flat Boxing. He actually dropped a link to the Langford versus Flynn fight, which may be that second or third one. And he's showing where the cartwheel actually took place, which is at the 1308 mark, and he leveled.
Oh, good looks. Yeah, it's a great moment.
Leveled him from there, which I think that's pretty dope. And real quick, also, we got Doug in the chat. Doug W, appreciate you being here. Doug says Tiger Flower is such a good win on Langford's resume. Indeed, especially at that particular time. As far as Langford, we know being past it and not the fighter that he essentially was, and still he beat one of the great middleweights that we've seen in the history of boxing, which I think speaks volumes. And real quick, Random Flat Boxing says, I think if the Curler line didn't exist, or if it would have somehow, or if he, being Langford, would have somehow got a world heavyweight championship, he would be widely recognized as the greatest fighter to ever live, even by the casuals. I think I can agree with you with 100% certainty there, Flack Boxing. I think that speaks volumes as well. The fact that if he would have gotten that proper title shot, especially the heavyweight title, which is the marquee championship, and still to a certain degree is the case today, then Sam Langford's name would ring bells even further across the pantheon of sports in general.
Yeah, I agree. I think a big step would be like something I noticed when I got interested in boxing history is that the way it's discussed compared to the way it was discussed in the day. Like, so I have a newspaper clipping from, I think it's the Boston Post. It's either the Post or the Globe. Both were like the main newspapers in New England. Like I said, Boston was one of the biggest scenes. Like George Garvey, you mentioned, he taught in Boston. The great George Dixon is buried about a mile from my house. He fought in Boston. You know, Langford was based in Boston. Joe Walcott was based in Boston. Belfield Walcott was based in Boston. You know, like this was one of the best places for fighting in the country. The purses were bigger in California, but this was one of the best places. The tapestry here was just incredible. But anyway, oh, sorry, hold on. That looks like a good comment right there.
Oh yeah, good to go. Yeah, that's Poland Ball 69. So appreciate your Poland Ball. Definitely love the dialogue, man. Appreciate you being on the channel without a doubt. He says Langford is a solid number 2 pick for me behind Greb. To put into perspective how insane his achievements were, imagine if someone beat Loma, drew with Crawford, and beat Golovkin, then dominated heavyweight. Yeah, I think that pretty much speaks to it right there. And he carried that power. We saw what Manny Pacquiao was able to do rising from, I believe, flyweight. It could have been a little bit before flyweight, but I believe it was flyweight where Manny Pacquiao rose, and he was able to carry his power up to welterweight. He even went to 154, even though in catchweight capacity, but he was able to carry his power for the most part. But once he got to welterweight, things started to slow down as far as the knockouts and everything, because when you're fighting at that level, and the amount of knockouts that you can get at that level, that's what slowed down for Pacquiao. But in the case of Langford, he continued to fight, move up, and he was able to carry that knockout power, which I think is, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, one of the separating things as far as him and Greb. Though certainly if you have Harry Greb as your number 1 fighter, I mean, it's hard to argue against it as well, because we know Harry Greb had a pretty amazing career. But Langford's ability to carry that power is a critical piece of the whole matter.
Yeah, I think finishes. I mean, it's the matchups often determine like the odds of a finish. You know, that's the way the styles interact and where they are in their careers and this relative size. But got to put some weight, I feel like, on because that takes the judges out of the equation. As long as it's a fair finish, a timely finish, it takes the judges out of the equation, and it's easier to say that was definitely the one guy definitely got the best of that fight because he literally finished him. But Langford, Archie Moore, some of these guys, the amount of finishes they have, you know, Marciano too, for a shorter career, another great fighter.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't have as big a resume, but the success relative to what he attempted, the success he found was incredible, and his work ethic. Even all these generations later, he's known as someone like Marvin Hagler is another guy who'll be remembered. Like, get that work in. If you put the work in, you get results. If your body can take it. So Marciano is one of those guys. And
I think that's a good point you mentioned there. I think that it comes down to ties into what you do, when you're able to get in the ring, or when you're in your career and you have these opportunities as far as some of those separators, because we say, of course, when we compare fighters of today, and it's hard to compare them with guys back then, just given the amount of differences between the two eras. But essentially, you can have a shorter career, and we saw this with Marciano, as you mentioned. But even during that time, James Jeffries or Jim Corbett, for instance, you could have a shorter career, but if you're not putting in the level of competition, or you're not factoring that in, that's where some of the scrutiny comes about. So the guys today who fight less, if you're fighting less and you're not fighting the best competition available, then it's understandable where some scrutiny comes in, and why some who are more akin to the history side of things would say that a fighter of the past rates higher or is a bit better, just given what they were doing and who they were fighting during the period. And that level of competition, because by the same token, there are also guys who fought a lower level of competition who are regarded even during those eras. And it's no different than the fighters today who fight a lower level of the competition, or they don't take on the absolute best and try to improve upon the legacy from that standpoint.
Yeah, that's a great point, Josh. There are fighters in the past who fought at a high level relative to how many fights they had. You mentioned Jeffries, Corbett, Jimmy Britt. But in general, over time, having done less epic things than other guys, they're less remembered than guys who did more epic things. Like Dempsey, like I feel like the myth of Dempsey has overtaken his actual accomplishment. But at the same time, there are people who say Dempsey did nothing. That's entirely inaccurate. It's like the middle ground is really where it's at. Dempsey, to me, when we did a countdown, were you in on our heavyweights countdown, Josh? Did we do?
No,
I know
I
it was
wasn't
BL and
in
Scrap.
on that. I wasn't in on that one, but yeah, it was
We
a
were
good
probably
one.
afraid it would go too long, so we did our top 10 heavyweights. And like there are guys who were good, but they don't show up very high because the size of the resume, because they've done more epic things. Langford to me is a top 3 heavyweight. I don't insist on it. I don't insist that people are totally wrong if they have other, like, say, modern greats like Lewis and guys I had inside 10, but not quite as high because the size of the resume. But to me, like, if you look at Langford's level of opposition at heavyweight, BL did a fantastic video today. That's Hardline Boxing Talk, folks. Go check that channel out.
Shout out Hardline.
Yeah, shout out to the boxing librarian, BL. I'll just call him that on here furthermore. And, he's comparing these careers. Johnson had a great career. To me, he's a top 5 heavyweight of all time. Again, I don't insist on it. There's so many ways to rate fighters, but I tend to go on everything's relative to the level of competition. So you can be undefeated. There are guys who've had wonderful undefeated runs against lower competition who we don't remember, or sometimes, unfortunately, even get made fun of. Like, I see people use Sven Aki all the time as a like, well, what about him? The guy did good, right? He went undefeated, but because he didn't have the higher level of competition, there's a context. Now, there's a lot of guys like that throughout boxing history, and Langford has a lot of losses. But if you look at the context of his career, like before he had hit his prime, he was fighting at a world-class level and also fighting a very busy schedule in general. Then when he hit his prime, he literally had dozens of fights against all-time great heavyweights. To me, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Harry Wills, Jack Johnson are all top 10 heavyweights of all time.
Yeah,
I believe that.
And that's I think that is a very good point, because of the fact that it was actually 1905 when Langford first fought Joe Jeanette. You're talking one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, and he fought against him in 1905. Keeping in mind, folks, he turned pro late in 1902. So by 1905, he's in with Joe Jeanette, and he's started at the lightweights, Langford that is, and taking on one of these guys who would go on to become one of the great heavyweights of all time. So I think that right there speaks volumes as well, just to how good he was. And real quick, random. Doug W had mentioned random fantasy match would be Langford versus Marciano. You kind of spoke on that in terms of what some of those advantages would be for Langford, who has a pretty good, solid reach for his size as well as wingspan. I know his reach was somewhere near mine, and I'm 5'11" as far as height's concerned. And Langford, he had a reach that was comparable, being at 5'6.5", 5'7", or wherever you kind of throw him in the mix at.
Yeah, Langford's reach was, I think, 73.5. And but he was about 5'7.5", I think, at his full height. It gets reported differently, but I've seen a lot of 5'7.5" when he was in his prime. He's I don't know if that's I don't know if they measured it in the boxing shoes at the time, but he was a short guy, but he had such a reach. And I think with specifically Marciano. Now, I'm not saying Langford would have as easier time, say, against. personally feel like Archie Moore would be a tougher fight for Langford because of Moore's combination punching, his trickiness, and his angles, and the traps he would set. Langford set a lot of traps himself, but Moore was a crafty guy. I just think Rocky, it just lines up badly for him because what he has to do to beat Langford is Langford's specialty is guys coming at him, trying to get close and knocking them out. And that included smaller guys and bigger guys. That's why the people who did get the best of him kept him on the end of the jab. McVeigh, when he, Flynn wrestled him, but like I said, I think Langford was, it seems that Langford was carrying him. And I say that because so many writers were saying it, not because I've seen the first fight, obviously. No one living has seen it, but, but Langford, like, let me think. So McVeigh beat him, drew with him fighting on the retreat in 1911, then beat him at the end of the year, snapping a 21 fight streak. And that was the first actual proper loss he'd had since that fight back in 1906 against young Peter Jackson that followed the Jack Johnson loss. So he finally gets a points loss at the end of 1911. McVeigh fighting on the retreat, even though he's the big guy. Then I think in 1913, Gunboat Smith keeps him on the end of the jab, upsets him. Langford came in out of shape. Then, like pretty much to get the best of him, unless he had an off night, you had to you couldn't just get in there and battle him. So someone like Rocky, you literally had to get in there and battle. He didn't have a meaningful jab. I don't like his chances. I do think Archie Moore would give him or Ezra Charles will give him a hell of a fight because they had a combination of speed and savvy and range. They could fight at range. Like Archie Moore, I love watching his old fights. He'd sort of like lean off the center line and then boom, dart up with a diagonal jab. Just poetry. He's setting traps the whole time. I think for Langford, like the cleverer fighters could give him trouble. Just like, people wanted desperately to see the rematch with Jack Johnson, but they weren't all so sure. They thought Langford give him a go of it, but they didn't know if he could win. They might have said so, but like there was a lot of question about who would win because Johnson was brilliant. Like I said, he's one of the greatest heavyweights. And even though he wouldn't fight those three great contemporaries then, he'd already fought them all. And when he fought Jeanette and McVeigh, they were more in prospect status, but they were already heavyweights. Langford had been a small middleweight when he fought Johnson, so maybe that doesn't count as much. But Johnson won easily. He was tired at times. Like one of the reports from the people on the ground said that Johnson was in trouble. He knocked Langford down in the 6th round. They thought he wouldn't last. The betting was whether Langford would last mostly, not whether he would win. They thought he would be gone by 10 rounds, but by the end of the 6th round, Johnson was tired and he was in a bit of a way. So so it wasn't that Johnson didn't win easily. He did win easily, but the first couple rounds were even. Langford might have even, I think maybe in the 3rd, got like one of the early rounds, he might have just got the edge of the best of it, but like pretty soon the size and the brilliance of Johnson. But my point was, like, the fight that didn't happen, that doesn't mean that it was definite that Langford would smash Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson's an all-time great, and he was crafty and knew how to use his size. Similarly, Langford, the reason he was avoided is because he knew how to use his dimensions. It wasn't size overall, but it was his combination of reach and a low set head, and the fact that he had more experience than anyone he was fighting.
Oh yeah.
Like once he got into the full groove, so the fight with Johnson, that was only really like I think his 3rd heavyweight fight. But then you're talking later in his career when he's had 40 of them. He's fought 40 guys taller and bigger than him. That's a different game. And his specialty was smacking around the big dudes who couldn't get out of his way.
Oh yeah.
So but I just wanted to make clear that it's not to say that Johnson would have definitely lost to him. No, people wanted to see the fight, and it would have drawn so well because they weren't sure, because they were the best.
Yeah, that would have been very intriguing with Langford at heavyweight when they fought it, or if they had fought at that particular time. Now, shout out to Miter Span, man. Appreciate you dropping by, Miter. Much love showing it. Send my regards to you. He says Sam Langford was a heavyweight champion in so many countries. It is ridiculous that they didn't officially recognize him as a world champion. He was a world beater. That is very much true. He went all over the place, and he's one of those take on any and all comers type fighters. And you're right, he was racking up belt after belt. The only one eluding him being the world heavyweight title, which had he won it, or at least had he got the opportunity, he'd had a very high possibility of potentially winning such. And we know that, as you were mentioning, Jack Johnson, he didn't give them that opportunity. I think there's a quote from Jack Johnson where he mentions fighting Langford, and when he fought him at that particular time, of course, Johnson then being a heavyweight and Langford being more of a, I guess you could say, middleweight. He mentioned never again, as in, like, no, he was not going to get back in there with him again, and certainly not under the circumstances of him holding the world heavyweight title.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to note. So Langford was hands down the hardest hitter of his generation, and it was so clear. Even Johnson said he couldn't hit like Langford. And it's like these greats that existed all in the same weight class. Like, so you think of the Four Kings era, right? Why are they the Four Kings? They all fought each other. We didn't get the full expression back in the day. They didn't get the full expression because when Jeanette, Langford, and McVeigh were in their primes, when Johnson won the title in 1908, I think he was about 30, which in those days was not young for a fighter. In fact, when Langford fought Jack O'Brien, they were calling him an ancient fighter, and he was 33. Just to give you some perspective. So, like, Johnson's prime happened while they were coming up. By the time they had realized the full expression of their abilities, he was a little bit older, even though he held the world title and he was better than the guys he was fighting. But that's who was he fighting, so we see that today, though. The champions get a little older, they get a little more selective. They know that they're not going to have that many more fights. Then the young guns, people can win on reckless abandon and youthful vigor even today, or sometimes just with a very simple game plan that catches someone off guard. Like, and I'm not picking on Lomachenko because I love watching him fight. But who was it? Lopez beat him, right? How did he beat him? Well, he just kept the center of the ring and kept a stiff jab and kept his right hand close. I can't remember if he's a southpaw or not, but he just basically stuck behind the jab, and he won the first 6 rounds that way. And then by the time Lomachenko finally adjusted, it was too late. He lost the decision. That happens to fighters. Like, that's why you want, like, Langford, he had so much experience. He'd seen it all, so it was very hard to stump him. It was very hard to do something he couldn't figure out when he had his full mobility. And even, like, McVeigh was able to edge him in December of 1911 in their first fight that they had between them in Australia, their second fight of the year, but their first fight in Australia. That was a close one. Not everyone thought that McVeigh should have gotten that decision. Even doing it that way, even with that game plan, because he was on the retreat, Langford did the leading. But it's contentious decisions is, it's hard. But they fought 4 times the next year, and Langford won all 4 and stopped him in 2 of them. So they did settle. They did. But then they had more fights. I think that was their. So let's see. They had 2 fights in 1911. They had 4 fights in 1912. 1 or 2 in 13. So they ended up having 15 fights, just to make sure. And Langford did get the best over the course of the rivalry, but he didn't go undefeated. And it was McVeigh that finally kind of figured out the puzzle at the end of 1911, because Langford, other than that close one with Jim Flynn, which was sort of wrestling heavy, Flynn was 15 pounds heavier, used his size a little bit. Langford, it seemed like, was basically doing what they said, keep bread on the table, let him go the distance and then get a big fight for long booking and smash him.
Yeah, excellent. That is excellent stuff. I think that just the ability for him to be able to do that, gauge things, of course, and maybe handicap himself in some sense, just to make sure that, of course, you put on a show, because that's what the fans at least came for. And during those times, they most certainly acquiesced to such means as far as how they went about it. And I think that is a great stuff that you're mentioning there. Real quick, I wanted to shout out Bruce Gass, Boxing Jazz and More, who says salute to
big up Bruce,
myself, you as well, Random. Of course, yeah. Hey, everyone, check out Bruce Gass, entertaining. A lot of great stuff going down over there on his channel. Love to talk about the old school as well, especially the heavyweight division. So salute to Bruce. Appreciate you being in here. Now, there was a question that came from Poland Ball, or at least more so a statement and a question. He said Langford is very underrated. He's a very underrated head-to-head fighter. How do you see him versus the likes of Joe Louis, James J. Jeffries, Rocky Marciano, and Dempsey? And he mentions he thinks he has a very good chance against all, which I too agree that he very much does have a chance against all of them, whether that's via a decision or in some cases potentially a knockout.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think Dempsey's all like Langford's all wrong for Dempsey because again, he could like a hooker. And this was written about. It's not just my opinion, but it's informed by what I've seen other people who saw both. That Dempsey, the way he approached a fight, he'd be a sitting duck for Langford because of his short power and his ability to hit from any angle and his long reach and the fact that he had the reflexes, like prime versus prime, not a good fight for Dempsey. Marciano, I already said, I mean, it's never to count out The Rock, you know what I mean? But at their best, Langford was about Marciano's weight, maybe a couple pounds lighter, but he like Rocky hit hard, but he had to get real close. Langford had long ass arms and gigantic shoulders. Like Rocky was a taller fighter. He'd actually be trying to come underneath with short arms to a guy who was shorter than him with longer arms. It's all wrong. Jeffries was very nimble for a big guy at his best, but he wasn't very skilled. He wasn't primarily a technician. I don't want to take away from him because he beat some good fighters. So he obviously was good. But
yeah, you're correct in that regard, though. So yeah, he wasn't as heralded on the technical side of things for sure.
Right, but he might last the distance against Langford because he could take some punishment. So I don't want to sell him short. I don't know that if he could beat Langford because Langford's skill level and, like I said, his experience was just far exceeded Jeffries. It's a multiple. So prime versus prime, I'd take Langford, but I don't know if he stops him. He would school him, I believe, but not stop him. Joe Louis is a tough fight. I don't know who wins that. Joe Louis was trained by the great Jack Blackburn, who fought Langford multiple times. Jack Blackburn had many very successful seasons. I mean seasons where where he goes like 14-1, 16-0, stuff like that. He had a few of those. Jack Blackburn was a great fighter. Joe Louis was bigger than Langford and it was taught with a similar style, although it was modified because Joe Louis was taller and heavier, so he had to crouch a little bit and come to the side. Langford would do that himself, but Langford was already short, so he didn't have to duck as much. But Lewis's style was informed on what Langford did. Blackburn considered Langford to be the bee's knees, man. He was a fan. So, he thought Langford was the stuff. So if you look at his primary, he trained lots of great fighters, but like Joe Louis, his protege, was designed to be the Langford of his era with
Sammy
modifications
Mandel
for his size.
I think it was Sammy Mandel.
Yeah, was it Bud Taylor as well? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, it might have been.
He taught some dudes, but and for a time, not for very long, but Jersey Joe Walcott trained under him at one point, I think.
Oh yeah.
But Jersey Joe goes so underrated because he peaked late in his career when everything came together for him because he struggled, man. He had a hard financial existence for years. So when it all came together for him, he was already kind of old. But that's how that goes sometimes. He made the most of it. But he goes very underrated, and people use it to downcast Marciano as though he didn't beat a great fighter that night. It's like, got to look a little closer than the numerical record, man, as a context. Langford piled up some losses across his 300 fights. But in context, when you look at him at his best, he wasn't piling up losses. It's just that he fought way past his prime, long into blindness. I mean, there aren't that many guys. Harry Greb did it with one eye, but Langford ended up fighting with no eyes. Like he had no sight in one eye. And then during the fight, when he would get hit in the other eye, he would start to lose his vision in that one until a few days after the fight. And he still kept a winning record.
Yeah, that's insane. So, about that. Of course, you wouldn't see that today.
It's almost like, but you see the skill level, like say James Toney, right? Not that big into training, big into sparring, and brilliant, and so calm under pressure, right? Good chin. Imagine if James Toney had fuck you power. Like old James Toney had George Foreman style, not weight behind his punches, because Langford at his heaviest, I think, was still only a little bit over 200, 210 something. Mm-hmm. But imagine if they had that kind of concussive power of the all-time great punchers, just not very mobile. Still a tough fight. James Toney was a great fighter, and he was dangerous at heavyweight, but he didn't have that crushing power. Langford kept his crushing power, but he also had that kind of smoothness of technique and ability and understanding of the interaction of the human form, because he had seen everything. So now he couldn't see it all. He still had that memory of, and that's how he got Tiger Flowers. Reportedly, he was like, comes in from the first round. He's been hit with a shit ton of fight. Am I allowed to swear? Do you swear on your channel?
Oh yeah. That's fine.
Okay, I don't want to be inappropriate, but yeah, he's had a, he's got hit by a shit ton of punches. He says, kid's making mistakes. If he keeps going, I got him, and then he gets him out of there. He knew what the solution was because he'd seen everything. So even though this great fighter, Tiger Flowers, who himself was a multi-weight threat, I've seen reports of him where they were praising him and saying that just like Joe Walcott, Joe Gans, and Sam Langford, he had to fight above his weight to get matchups.
Oh yeah.
And Langford would be one of those guys. He did it, that he fought to get opportunity, and didn't go his way. But Langford's a special case because and there's a tragedy woven in, because he didn't get his opportunity. He didn't make enough money to be able to stop fighting. But because of that, he built up an incredible resume long after he should have retired. Just taking from mid-1917, when Fred Fulton took his left eye in Boston, one of his eyes, I think it was his left eye, I'm not actually sure, but took his eye in Boston. He had a whole hell of a lot of fights and fought until 26. I think he finally stopped for good. So that's a whole career. That's more fights than most of the active fighters today have had. He had with one eye or less. One or less eyes. It's really mind-blowing, but it came out of desperation. It's the only thing he knew how to do. His manager, Joe Woodman, parted with him, although they remained friends, parted with him over this conflict, because he said, look, you're going to go blind permanently. Sam's like, well, this is what I got to do. This is all I do. So he stopped managing him.
Yeah,
but
it was about that action.
So all we can do is celebrate. A lot of these guys, they don't get to live out. They do great things. They don't get to live it out. Stanley Catchell died young. You can look at Tiger Flowers, didn't get to live it out himself, right? Lots of these guys. Unfortunately, Harry Greb, he fought basically to death. He had almost 300 fights in 13 or 14 seasons, and died on the operating table. And it's like, so all they get is the celebration. They didn't get to live out in comfort. George Foreman, celebrated, rich, just feeling the love from all their fans. So we can give them a little bit back into the system on their behalf. And guys like Langford, he was kind of in obscurity for many of the years after his retirement, even though he was celebrated in some level. After a generation or two, he was just some guy, one of the many guys who just blew his money. So he made a lot of money, but he had a tremendous amount of fights and had a camp around him that he was paying for. That money goes away quick,
Oh,
so he estimated he might have made $500,000, but so much of that went in expenses that it was over 20 something years. So it's not like some of these boxers who made fortune and kept it. Some guys are careful with their money. Other guys like John L. Sullivan and, plenty of guys, they burned through their thing, the high life. Bob Fitzsimmons himself, right? Didn't Fitz die broke? So sad.
Yeah, I believe that was the case, and still fighting, I believe, well into when he should have stopped. And that makes it very, sad state to see such or fighters break down as they get near the end or whatever, and then with the support gone and all that stuff, and essentially kind of forgotten in some sense. And Langford was one of those guys that, of course, like you mentioned, lost some luster in retirement and all that stuff, and then over the course of many years. But I think more and more people today are recognizing just how great a fighter he was and what he meant for the time. And quickly, Random, want to mention Poland Ball 69. He said he, being Langford, definitely had the power to trouble all of them, not to mention great technique and patience. Jeanette fight, for example, and he favors him against Rocky, Jack, and Jeffries. Good stuff. Miters fan said, Langford was still able to smile after all he went through. My favorite boxing personality. Yeah, that is certainly a true. Even when they found him later in life, he had no ill will or hard feelings. And you think about guys like that and some of the others, a lot of them also had bad contracts from a management standpoint, so they probably weren't getting the share that they rightfully should have been getting.
That's a good point. I think he had a 1/3 split or to 1/4 split with Joe Woodman on his purses. I don't know if that counted side bets though. That may not have counted because a lot of times fighters would put either their own money, but also sometimes their backer would they'd have an arrangement and their backer would put up a side bet or post the forfeit. So one of the ways in the early part of Langford's career, certainly, you know, someone, basically a manager would go give $300, say, for instance, to one of these writers, leave it at the offices of one of the newspapers as a forfeit, or they put it in escrow like with some entity, someone who's respected in the community. So now they said, I'm challenging you, and I posted a forfeit. So basically, if someone accepts that challenge, it could be an open challenge or to one guy, and the other guy backs out who made the challenge, they get to keep that money. So it's a way of saying, I'm serious. I put my money where my mouth is, literally. We don't see that so much today. We don't see someone be like, I want to fight you. I put $1 million in escrow. You can keep it if I back out of the fight, you know, like, so it was different. The matchmaking at the time was different, but sometimes these fights come together very, very quickly because guys were so busy that the factors in a bracket could change in a matter of a couple months. Within a few months, a top guy could have been seen to have gone back and not be a factor anymore. Like someone ended his aspirations. He got beat so bad. New guys get those fights. It's very bloodthirsty.
Yeah.
Pulling ball, making a good point. Yep. Grabbing Langford at the top is fine by me.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I think that, you know, you can't go wrong with that for sure. And I think that, of course, both of them are big names in the sports history. So therefore, I mean, it makes sense that people would rate them highly and view them close as far as potential matchups, competition-wise, as well. So, Flat Boxing says Langford had a very good distance measuring lead hand in the third fight with Jim Flynn. One of the things I see working very well against guys in fantasy matchups. Yeah,
that's an excellent point, Flack, because that was part of his specialty, was keeping people at his range, especially if they were trying to close the gap. So people being like, oh, he's little, I'll just run him over. Lots of guys got knocked out trying to do that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, without a doubt. And Flat Boxing says still I would take Marciano against Langford. I think it would be an amazing fight, but there's maybe 10 men who ever lived. I take against Rocky on the inside. Most certainly. Yeah, Rocky. And he had
that's cool, man. Rocky was great. He was a fantastic fighter. I don't like the matchup for him, but I'm frequently wrong. So I'm not going to insist on it.
Same here. He was supremely dedicated to his training and just endurance and strength. He was definitely one of those guys who would be hard to get out of there. And
Langford would have to fight him like he did Flynn. He'd have to fight him at mid-range. He couldn't like just tie Rocky up because Rocky was so strong on the inside because he had those short power arms, like forearms, like my legs, thicker than my legs. Mm-hmm. What am I talking about? So like so like if he couldn't do like he did with Dixie Kid, where he tie him up with one arm and then punch him in the kidneys with the other arm. That's another factor too. Which rule set do they fight under? Because I think if the closer you get to Langford's rules, the worse it is for Rocky.
Oh yeah.
Like if you fight in America in Langford's time, you know, he can, if he knocks Rocky down, he doesn't have to give him space at all. He just goes stand over next to him in case as soon as those knees and hands touch, you know, as soon as the knees and hands are up off the canvas, he can start punching him again. I think that for someone with Langford's power and the fact that, you know, Langford had a ridiculous chin, he could take it. And with those long arms, it just makes for a hard night. But again, Marciano beat guys who seemed to have stylistic advantages over him by the fact that he could take it himself. He took punches, Charles, that split his nose in two, but he took it. He got hit so hard his nose split, but he didn't fall apart. So Rocky was special. He doesn't have the same resume, but in a head-to-head matchup, I have the greatest respect for Marciano. Most of the time, I think he finds a way, but I just think it's the tough one.
Oh, yeah.
Just that specific one.
I'm in agreement.
Their guys, I think, would be tough. I think someone like Larry Holmes would be very tough for Langford. With that jab, that flicking jab, I think Holmes at his best would be a nightmare for someone like Langford. But I don't know that Holmes would beat everyone Langford beat, or vice versa. But I think that matchup is a tough one as far as a big guy who could trouble him. And same with Ali because of the smoothness of the movement. stay on the outside. Ali just jab his head up all night. Never give him a chance to. Although I got to say, Liston managed to get to Ali's body, and if Liston can get to Ali's body, Langford had arms and a chest like the heavyweights. Not the reach of Liston, but he had the chest of Liston. Think about that. He's 5'7.5" with Liston's chest, legit, like 44 inches, unexpanded. It's a crazy, crazy dimension.
Yeah, crazy. Those proportions are
He's a triangle.
absolutely insane. Yeah, it's
He was a
insane
bigger
to think
version of Barbados. Yeah, he was like a bigger version of Barbados Walcott.
about. Oh yeah.
But Barbados Walcott fought all the way up to heavyweight. While he was the welterweight champion, he was fighting heavyweights, but he didn't have as many fights. And he also, even though he issued the challenges, he didn't get as many heavyweight takers as Langford did.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah. You make a very good point. And yeah, I think that, as I mentioned, I keep saying speaks volumes. That just showed you. And I believe a lot of his peers gave him those types of accolades as well. So Poland Ball says Blackburn thought Greb and Langford would trouble Lewis, which yeah, they very well could have troubled him. And yeah, they had an interesting.
I mean, Blackburn's one to know. Yeah, Blackburn's one of the most underrated figures in boxing history to me. But Lewis, the thing is, Lewis, his style was well suited to take on someone like Langford's style. So even though Langford had more experience and might have been a better fighter, pound for pound, he was 15 or 20 pounds lighter. At his best, he was 15 or 20 pounds lighter than Lewis at his best. And so if they actually went against each other, the punching power would probably be similar. Lewis is a little rangier because if he leans forward, he can get a couple of inches more because of his height. It's a tough fight. It's a tough fight both ways. I like it. I think it'd be an all-time great battle. But I think if I could pick one fight, I would want to see Archie Moore, like the young old Archie Moore, when he had the height of the best overlap between his skill and his still having some youth left. Fight Langford. I think that would just be incredible. Because Moore was clever, and that's what you needed. You needed fight IQ. You couldn't be if you were a dumb bruiser, Langford would just knock you out. His career's filled with the carcasses of guys who just thought they just go bully the little guy. Especially as like Langford did something that Barbados Walcott and certain other short fighters have done, which is you can block with the top of your head. If someone's just wailing away, you can let them punch the top of your head, and especially back then in the little gloves, they'll lose their hands before they rattle your brain if you do it right. And I've seen writing on that, like it's easy to spoil your knuckles on like a Barbados Walcott who was 5'1.5", but mostly fighting guys middle. Like he was fighting bigger guys sometimes, but not to the degree Langford was. Langford was taller, but he was fighting giants. Some of these guys are big. It's not like the myth of today is that everyone's big today and that everyone was small back then. No, there were some big fellas, and the proportion of big people who were likely to go into boxing was larger then. So today, yeah, there are lots more big people around today, all these hormones in our food, but are they all boxing? No, they're not. They're playing basketball in the NFL, and even some of the mid-sized large guys are playing soccer, or they're playing rugby, or they're playing ice hockey. You know what I mean? It's not like back then, if you were a big tough guy and you weren't a gangster, then boxing was for you, or wrestling, something along those lines. There weren't that many vocations for big tough guys who were desperate for money. So boxing was the way out.
Oh yeah.
So in Langford's day, a lot of guys, a lot of tough characters, people fight for fun, fight for bets on the street. Fist fighting was a lot more acceptable and a lot more prevalent, and the sport of boxing. So even though, like heading into 1903, I think it was only legal in maybe 24 states in the U.S.
Oh yeah.
But there were probably 5 or 6 athletic clubs just in the city of Boston, all putting on fights. They were like in the week schedule for New England. Just for New England, the collection of states, Northeast U.S., was ridiculous. There's fights every night of the week, or usually not Sunday, I don't think, but like just a packed schedule. And there's some stuff happening in other places that they would mention in the paper, but just the local schedule was ridiculous. If you were gambling or you had your own money and you could just travel around, you could go to a fight almost any night of the week. Take a train up to New Hampshire, and then go out to Rhode Island, or go to one of the clubs in Boston. Sometimes they'd overlap too, although not often. Sometimes you'd have some good fights going on at the same time in the same city, different club.
Yeah, we see that today, more access though. So you're on a different channel, different group, different promoter, all that good stuff. But yeah, yeah,
Much
just
different in the live gate era.
oh yeah,
That's and actually something you mentioned earlier about like carrying guys, fighting with handcuffs on, like letting guys go a certain distance. It wasn't like I've heard a lot of people say accurately that certain like colored fighters had to do that to get white opponents. Like they would either carry them the distance or they would say, okay, we'll go easy. I'll go easy the first 6, this and that.
hmm
But also there was a factor of someone like of Langford's ability when he was fighting someone he knew he could beat and he could take punches. Like early 1911, he let Fred Atwater give him 3 of his best shots before he took back over the fight. And this was a big guy up in New York, a heavyweight he fought at the beginning of the year. But he could take it, right? So he knew he could school these guys who weren't world class. And so he would ask the promoter sometime, reportedly, he would ask the promoter if he wanted a fast night or if he wanted to give the crowd a go, because this is the live gate era.
oh yeah,
Usually not filmed, right? Most of his fights weren't filmed. Couple that were filmed, I think the Tiger Smith fight in 1907 and the Sam McVeigh fight in Paris in April of 1911, they were filmed but didn't survive. But it's like the live experience. And like if you go to a fight, do you want to see a long fight or do you want to see a quick knockout? Or do you want to see an exciting fight followed by a nice knockout to get your money's worth? And Langford had that in his mind sometimes when certain promoters liked him because he could finish the guy in the first, but maybe he'd give him 3 or 4 rounds. And he might even be generous enough to ask the promoter if what kind of show he wanted. That's the level of ability Langford had. Like other guys have done it though. When George Foreman made his comeback, he wasn't just fighting killers. He was just getting his groove on, beating the hell out of guys, showing he was dangerous. Langford did some of that. Lots of guys have done some of that. Sometimes for title fights, as you know.
oh yeah, yeah. I
Not
mean,
every title fight's the same.
yeah,
Like
definitely
Greb and
blended.
Tunney, their first fight was for light heavyweight, like a region, like the Americas title, light heavyweight. Tunney's only loss,
Oh yeah,
wasn't even for a world title. Very important fight, but then we both are aware of many title fights that are almost meaningless. They're technically a title fight, but it's like not accomplished guys fighting for a vacant title doesn't stack up. It's the context. You know this though. I'm not telling you anything new.
yeah. Unfortunate in that sense for sure. Considering there were so many deserving. Doug W says, I think prime for prime, Jack Johnson is the best champion before Sonny Liston / Ali. All right, I feel you. Yeah, Jack, he definitely makes a case. Of course, we've mentioned the fact that Jack Johnson, when he initially won the world heavyweight title, and what transpired from there to when he lost it, yeah, he took an easier road as far as competition is concerned. But that being said, of course, he had to go through a lot of top level names to get to that point. And as you had
That's right,
mentioned,
Josh.
Random, yeah,
He had a
it's hard
schedule.
to say that Langford would have even beat him when Langford became a heavyweight because he was legit and good, especially defensively in that sense.
Absolutely. Johnson knew how to use his size like no other. So he was naturally bigger than Langford, taller, bigger, had his own range. And so, yeah, I don't know who would have won that fight. There were certain writers that thought Langford could turn the trick, but there are also some of the same writers thought Ketchel or Langford would be the guys to get Johnson out of there.
Mm.
They were wrong about Ketchel, but because of the power, Ketchel's hitting power, like Langford, he was known as a hitter, although Langford was the scarier hitter, but they were both celebrated for their power. But Johnson was brilliant. And he fought some really tough guys on his way up. Guys like Hank Griffin and Denver Martin. And who did he fight? Frank Childs. He lost
Hmm.
to Choinsky, but he fought Choinsky. I mean, Fitz. He fought some guys, Bill Lang. He fought guys who were credible before he fought Tommy Burns. And he was already seen as quite possibly the best heavyweight in the world for quite a few years. Like he lost a contentious decision to Marvin Hart
Oh
I
yeah.
think in '05, and that was the year that Marvin Hart fought Jack Root for Jim Jeffries' vacant title. But it wasn't a blowout. And it's just that Hart did the leading, so he got the decision. And now we've seen in other fights where the guy who does the leading, like Langford led in his fight with McVeigh in a close fight, didn't get the nod. So even though Johnson lost that fight, it wasn't like the Choinsky fight where he got knocked out. And
Yeah. And we
he
still see
fought a
some of those same
tremendous level
things with
of,
judging today as well, where they seemingly favor certain things. I think that is apparent, and you sometimes get controversial scores in those type of situations, which of course social media wasn't the case back then, but I know sometimes some in the newspapers will report who they actually thought won and the fact that it should have gone a certain type of way as far as the decision is concerned. But sometimes those prearrangements can throw uh, a wrench in the mix of things. Just thinking about it from that standpoint, because I think the no decision bout type states, they did a disjustice to those fighters like Langford, for instance, who would actually just dominate a guy, but if they weren't able to, say, for instance, get them out of there or knock them out, then it'll be automatically scored a draw or whatever. So that's where a big injustice is done when you look at the resumes of these guys.
yes, exactly, Josh. That's why it takes a closer look. Like in 1904, Langford's second full season when he fought Joe Walcott, under the 10-point must system, he wins the world title right then. He's the welterweight champion of the world. But the ref acknowledged he won more rounds, but he just thought that Walcott was aggressive late in the fight and it balanced out. So that's an instance where if you go by today's standards, Langford did what the criteria would say, beat Joe Walcott handily. But at the time, the ref considered a draw. And that was, even though the crowd didn't like it at first, because, this is a betting sport. So the crowd was not happy. They thought the title had changed hands because Walcott was the favorite and Langford surprised a lot of people by, you know, but he had already surprised a lot of people by beating Gans, even though he was a hot prospect and fought a great season. He'd already beaten Tim Kearns, Patsy Sweeney, a bunch of different dudes in 1903 when he fought Gans. He was the underdog for good reason. He was the underdog against Walcott, and they generously put Walcott's title hung on by a thread,
Oh yeah,
literally by the ref's interpretation. But that's why even though you can't say he beat Walcott, you can say that it meant something. The way, regardless of the result, the official result, it meant something because he did actually get the best in the majority of rounds. So even if that's all you can say, we're talking about against the great Joe Walcott, Barbados Walcott, the Barbados Wonder. It's a big deal, and it's just is only a second Hall of Fame fight. Not counting Jack Blackburn, who's in the Hall as a coach, should be as a fighter, but officially fighter Hall of Fame inductees, that's only a second out of 50 something, 60 something if you count Blackburn. It's crazy.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
crazy, man.
right.
He had more fights. He had more fights against Hall of Famers than many fighters have career bouts. Forget ranked fighters or champions that have fights in their whole career. We're
Oh,
talking about Lomachenko, 19 fights. 19 fights. Langford had 15 fights against McVeigh by himself,
yeah, that's
an
crazy.
all-time great heavyweight. I keep coming back to Lomachenko only because he's such an extreme example of incredible amateur success and skill, but very small number of pro fights. High level, but small number. So it's a
Mm,
good opportunity to contrast with someone like Langford, who had three mostly meaningless amateur fights, followed by over 300 known, possibly 400 or more, but 300 plus known pro fights.
yeah,
And
and
I do think, the guy who does more in the tougher rule set, it's going to stand out. And Langford, how many 20-round bouts did he have? I know BL would know this. Hardline Boxing Talk has already said this on a video, but I forgot. He had an awful lot of 20-round bouts.
yeah, I'm sure with the number of them, definitely double digits for sure. Uh, and ironically, we were talking about Mayweather earlier. So Blake Gallimore said Mayweather claims to be the greatest ever because of his undefeated record. How do you all think he competes against a prime Sam Langford or a prime Harry Greb? Good question. Great question there, Blake Gallimore. And Random and I were talking about Mayweather a bit earlier. Yeah, fundamentally, yeah, one of the greatest ever. And that certainly can't be taken away from him. and he did fight a high level of competition. Of course, the timing varied in terms of when some of those guys were at their peak, and some who were picked over in a sense. But that being said, I think Sam Langford and even Harry Greb, they're a different type of beast when you think about the conditions of their time. So Mayweather, he's the type that would translate to pretty much any era, and he would be likely still one of those top like Hall of Fame worthy boxers. But I think a guy like Langford, certainly, him landing on Mayweather, assuming they were fighting in the 140 something range or whatever, I think it would make a difference given his size.
Yeah, it's tough because like, when would you consider Mayweather's prime? Because Langford was world class at lightweight, welterweight, middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight, but he was only world class at lightweight for 1 year, welterweight for 1 year. Then he was pretty much middleweight and above. So when Langford was at his prime, he was 175 pounds
Mm.
fighting weight. So Floyd would die in a fight against a prime Sam Langford, and Harry Greb was a middleweight who could fight at heavyweight. Floyd would get absolutely battered. He'd have no time to. All that slick stuff goes out the door if you're eating 125 punches around coming at you and speeding up as the fight goes on. But it's the size difference too. Greb and Langford weren't the kind of guys you could be smaller than in their prime and have a good night. So much so that Langford was avoided by larger men than himself because of what he could do to guys his own size and smaller. People were like, they didn't want to even know. Because I think it was 1910 maybe. I'm not sure, but Langford was matched with Mike Schreck, who'd been a top middleweight contender.
Oh yeah.
And he absolutely ran him over. And of course, that doesn't help his chances of persuading the other middleweights of that era to fight him, because he just destroyed a guy who had a little bit of a reputation and had some good wins in his career. And that was Langford's curse, is he was so good that even if he would agree to carry the guy, he couldn't conceal his true, because of the schedule he needed to fight to make money, he couldn't conceal how good he was. So people did know how dangerous he was, and people would straight up bar him or decline fights with him. And then he had to fight above his weight to get matchups. And even then, he couldn't get all the guys to face him. He chased Tommy Burns as well. It wasn't just Jack Johnson who wanted that shot.
Oh
Langford
yeah.
was the other main guy angling for a shot by the end of 1908, because he hadn't lost since the fight right after the loss to Johnson in 06. He lost his next fight, but then didn't lose again. So by the end of 1908, he'd been undefeated over a ton of fights because he was a busy fighter. So he was the other guy along with Johnson. Then, so Johnson being booked and actually having a contract to fight Langford in May of 1909, and then it not happening, kicked off this enormous drama of Johnson's title reign. It wasn't just that he was going to fight the White Hopes. It was also that within the boxing community, he wasn't going to fight the greatest heavyweights of his day in this crazy era full of great heavyweights.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It would be like if Ali refused to fight Foreman, Frazier, and Norton, or pick your three most dangerous guys of his era, and he's beaten everyone else maybe, or he's fighting other guys, but he won't fight the greats in their primes. That's kind of what Johnson did. But like I said, Johnson had been fighting since the early to mid 1890s, so he
Mm-hmm.
had already had a whole career by the time he won the world title. And
Oh
so
yeah.
he fought the
He
guys
did.
he was better than. He made his money, but he had already done an awful lot. And so it's not to put him down to say he ducked the fight, because he did duck the fight. It was public knowledge. He broke a contract to duck the fight,
Mm-hmm.
turned down money from all over the world to not have it. But he was great, and he did plenty. And his whole career stacks up with anybody's at heavyweight, except Langford, Joe Louis, and Ali. I have
Oh yeah.
Johnson just below them, and I have the great Harry Wills, who got shafted himself. I have him top 5 as well.
Oh yeah, I do as well in relations to or in relation to Wills. Yeah, phenomenal fighter without a doubt, and at one point certainly the best heavyweight in the world, but he didn't get that elusive title shot, which is all too familiar. Now, Random Poland Ball 69 says, "Do you guys think that the lightweight welterweight version of Langford could hold his own against welterweights like Sugar Ray Robinson, Benny Leonard?" and Joe Gans and Galvalon, that lightweight welterweight range.
That's a really good question. The thing is, Langford, he was only at lightweight for part of one season. Well, no, I
Mhm.
mean, because he was a lightweight. He fought at 135 in the amateurs. Lightweight, I think, was 133, like I said, in the early part of his career. So he was a lightweight 1902 and then 1903 until December. So from December 1903 on, he wasn't a lightweight. So, I think these great lightweights and welterweights, some of them had so much experience. Like at welterweight, Langford again, by the end of 1904, he was fighting above welter. He was ready to go to middleweight and heavyweight in 1905. So someone like Robinson, who had a whole vast experience at lightweight, well, I think feather and light, if I'm not mistaken, then a welterweight might be tough. Although Langford would have a bigger frame, bigger dimensions, I think, like in the chest and so like shoulders, if not the height. But it's tough for him fighting these greats at a weight where Langford, even though he had a lot of experience very quickly, he didn't have a whole career arc that led up to lightweight. That was just a stepping stone on his way up to where he had his experience. But if you're talking about Robinson Langford at middleweight, I'd take Langford.
Oh
Langford could
yeah,
knock out heavyweights. He would knock out Robinson. All the slickness, but Langford had the range and the timing. He had his own timing and technique. Scrapbook. My
yes,
dude,
yes, sir.
Scrapbook Boxing. Folks, it's a must listen to channel. I assume, Josh, that all your listeners have the sense to have already subscribed to Scrapbook. But if you haven't, folks, prepare yourselves. He's doing a complete boxing history. That's all I'll say. Just go. You can't believe it until you see it. Go check
Oh
that
yeah.
series out.
Shout
Big
out
up Scrap.
Scrapbook
I hope
Boxing.
you're I hope you're working away on our little project. I don't think BL's announced what exactly it is, but folks, I'll just tease that the boxing librarian, Hardline Boxing Talk, and Josh City right here, and Scrapbook and myself are involved in a project that'll be announced soon. That's going to be epic. That's all I'll say.
Oh yeah, without a doubt.
That's
So
all
yeah,
I'll say.
yeah, yeah. Shout out to Scrapbook Boxing. Says how's it going? 86 Boxing and Random Acoustic Thoughts. Great topic, without a doubt. Yeah, definitely go check out Scrapbook. Give them a follow. A lot of great historic content, and that can be. We have some on YouTube, but it's hard to find stuff that goes in depth to the degree of Scrapbook. So salute to Scrapbook. Some good stuff. Appreciate you being here, without a doubt. Polo Ball says it's hard to say how Floyd performs. Greb is a bad style matchup for him, but I can see him potentially outpointing lightweight or welterweight Langford. Not sure if I favor him though. Yeah, that would be a tough task for him, given the flower, and or yeah, just given the power. I meant, and it would be very interesting to think about, or at least thinking about that potential matchup.
Yeah,
So
I think at lightweight, Floyd would have so much experience, all his amateur experience. He was much more complete fighter. Even though Langford was capable as a lightweight, he just didn't have enough experience. So he beat Gans, but that's
mhm.
one guy. I don't know between Floyd and Gans, but I do think that it might be tough as far as points because Floyd had so much experience fighting for points, and he was happy to fight for points, as we know. Not always in his career, but there were times
Oh
later,
yeah.
I suppose. And now welterweight, Langford got even more experience, but Dave Holly, the first time you met Dave Holly, Holly tricked him up. When Holly fought with out of a crouch, he could use the shoulder roll. He had some tricky stuff, and he was able to actually get a win off Langford the first time they fought. So maybe at welter, Floyd, the first time they fought, it would be tough for Sam. However, you know, it depends on the night because Sam hit awful hard, and that can be a game changer. And he was also a real tough. He was a scrappy guy. He could box or he could brawl. And you see that in the little bits of footage we have of his fights when Bill Lang, when Jim Flynn, Joe Jeanette knew better by their 10th fight. He knew better. But when those other guys went to go bang, Sam would just plant and go because he knew he had a better chin and a harder punch. And that was true earlier in his career. He could whap it out with somebody. He had an educated lead hand. He had a strong right straight, but he didn't have to finesse somebody. He was capable. So yeah, maybe those are tough fights. But I do think when I match Sam up throughout history, middleweight's where I really start taking him seriously because then you're talking, he began that like 1905, but by 1908, he's like the best middleweight in the world. He's the best light heavyweight in the world, and he's one of the best heavyweights in the world.
Oh
So
yeah.
that at that point, that's when you start as far as like someone's prime. So like someone like Floyd would die in the ring against a prime Langford. Sam would carry him as long as he wanted to, and then brutalize him only because he's just a tiny person. Sam
Oh
at his
yeah.
best was a powerhouse, a short powerhouse, but he wasn't a tiny person per se. He was just missing like 4 inches from his midsection. That's the way to think of Sam. He was a big guy who was missing some of his middle, so he was short. But he had the shoulders and arms of a big guy and the back muscles of a big guy. So it's just a unique build, and that was always noted about him. They did sometimes racist, sometimes not, but cartoons of him and his cartoonish reach compared to his height.
Oh yeah.
He was like a human cartoon, but he was also a scrappy kid who had a hard upbringing, who was plugged in with the right people, and who had the willpower to fight and liked the high life, liked to make a lot of money fighting, and was a natural, and who had experience. So everything came together to make Sam Langford one of the great fighting machines.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Without a doubt. And
Yeah, sorry, Flack. I know that seems like it seems a little casual, a little, but it's just the honest matchup. It's almost like, it'd be like, what if Henry Armstrong fought Marvin Hagler? You'd be like, well, Henry Armstrong is real good, but he's a microscopic individual compared to Marvin Hagler. It's not a fair fight.
yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. So certain points or things like that factor in weight, and just who with a guy like Hagler spending all of his time at middleweight. So yeah, that will make it a tough task. Poland Ball mentions yes, but at lightweight he still managed to beat Gans, and at the welter he managed to nearly beat Walcott, both in their prime. That is true. Langford was going up against these guys in their prime, and they gave him a run, but Langford tended to prevail in most cases, even even though he was still essentially a kind of early career boxer who was learning some of the tricks of the trade, but he was formidable, and
That's a great point.
that's a good stuff for sure.
Yeah, I think I don't want to undersell Langford, and I find myself in a weird position as celebrating him as much and studying him so much, and then like picking him to possibly lose in these matchups. I just don't want to conflate like my appreciation of his overall career with a specific matchup with other great fighters, because they have their own abilities. So like, as much as I'd like to think Langford could not only beat Gans but beat Benny Leonard and Roberto Duran and Floyd Mayweather and Sweet Pea on the same night, I don't actually know how those styles match up, and he doesn't
Hmm.
have a resume that stacks up with theirs at that weight. Now if you get up to middleweight and above, there are a lot of great fighters where Sam Langford, you can take the Pepsi Challenge with their resume to resume, but at those lower weights, Langford just passed through them because he was a teenager growing up. That said, yeah, man, Barbados Walcott was ferocious and hugely experienced at multiple weights, and an all-time great stylist, and also like a short guy who was used to fighting taller guys. Like Langford wasn't tall for a heavyweight, but he wasn't short like a welterweight. He was at the time, he was right in there. So Walcott was brilliant. So, but I don't think that's the same kind of matchup, because Walcott had a huge bag of tricks. So hey, maybe I'm not sure what would happen in those fights. I'd probably have to think about it a lot more. But I wouldn't automatically pick Langford to start beating all the greats at lightweight and welterweight who had their own vast experience there, fighting at that speed and tempo. Like once you get to middle, though, a lot of these guys, Langford would thrash them. Not all of them, but a lot of the guys would stand very little chance, simply because of the attributes that Langford had that were unique to him, combined with his experience.
Yeah, yeah, I think that makes sense, and I think that's a good point for sure. Uh, it's tough when you're up there at that level. That level is not a ton that separates those guys who are the elite of the elites. So I'm sure he will make a game, or at least make it a tough competition for anyone he faces who's in their prime and a bit older and more polished and all of that stuff. But uh, yeah, Langford, one of a kind in some sense. Poland Ball or Black Boxing responding to Poland Ball mentioned he was 17-year-old kid when he defeated Gans, who was 29 and in his prime. Yeah, that's big time. You don't see that these days, and some people, they scoff at a middleweight or someone lower going up to heavyweight and having that type of success. But certainly it's possible. We've seen some video footage of different fighters where you have a guy like uh, Mickey Walker fighting and giving it a good go against the likes of Smelling, or well, no, the likes of Sharkey. He got knocked out by Smelling, but you think about that. That was a middleweight legitimately fighting heavyweight. You know, both of those guys, former world heavyweight champions. So it's not unreasonable to think that Langford would have success in there with bigger guys who are considered to be some of the top big guys in the history of the sport in itself, because he had the tool set to be able to, deconstruct some of those big fighters.
That's right. And like there weren't many boxers in history at heavyweight who were the biggest guy around when they were the top guy. We have that today, of course. One of the top heavyweights, Fury, one of the champions. So at least a piece of the championship is with the probably the biggest guy. There might be bigger. No, because Big Baby Miller weighs more than Fury. So maybe he's not the heaviest dude, but like, Fitz wasn't the biggest guy. Marciano wasn't the biggest guy of his
Yeah.
era. Joe Louis wasn't the biggest guy of his era. Ali wasn't the biggest guy of his era. Braddock wasn't the biggest guy of his era. Langford, including the colored champions, Langford, Childs, Armstrong wasn't particularly heavy. He got so later. Ed Martin wasn't the heaviest of his career, but you know, like Jack Johnson gave up 20 pounds to Denver Ed Martin when he beat him for the colored heavyweight championship. People think of Johnson as the big guy. He was the small guy at that time in his career compared to the champion who he dethroned. So it's like the way weight plays, it's the style and the approach and the fight IQ, and the top fighters find a way. And so some of these fighters in these fantasy matchups, some of them were more adaptable than others. So like if Archie Moore, Ezra Charles were fighting Langford and they were having trouble with a certain approach, they would switch it up. They were like playing chess. If Rocky was having trouble getting inside on Langford, he's fucked. He doesn't have an option. He's not like, oh, I'm gonna stay behind my jab and flick out the jab at range, because he has dwarf arms, even though they're huge in diameter. So it's just a tough. He doesn't maybe have as many avenues to victory. Whereas, say, like Ezra Charles, if you look at some of his footage, he has all kinds of ways to jack a guy up. He has all like algorithms and scientific formulas on destroying the human body. Same thing with Archie Moore, some of these other great technicians. But then within the technicians, certain guys' approach isn't going to translate to Langford. Take Bernard Hopkins, right? Great fighter, one of the great clinch fighters. He knew how to pull some tricks too, lead with his head, all this tricky shit. But is Hopkins going to be able to tie up Sam Langford? No, he's going to get his body, he's going to get his intestines ripped out of his midsection by some of the hardest punches that many heavyweights called Langford the hardest guy, the hardest hitter they ever faced. Jim Flynn, Harry Wills, Gumbo Smith, Jack Johnson. He wasn't, he didn't fight the hardest hitting version of Langford, but Jack Johnson acknowledged Langford as the hardest hitter of that generation. Tons of guys, Jeanette, McVeigh, all these guys knew it was no secret that he could punch, that baby could hit. And that's
Yeah.
part of his longevity, was even when he was a shadow of himself, but he could still hit, and he was heavier now, so he could hit, not with the same finesse, but he had all that experience to direct. So it's like you take a guy who's been on cruisers and you slow him down, you put him on a battleship. He can still go. It's just he can't make that as tight a turn. And that was Langford. And so he was a threat. He was always a threat. It's just the threat changed. But some of these great stylists at the lower weights, some of them could probably figure it out. Like Calzaghe, a big 168, cuts to 168 with a lightning jab, who knew how to get in and out, dart in and out, fight with a broken rhythm. Maybe that's a tough fight for Langford, but maybe not, because Langford knew to rip the body. That was his thing. He'd pressure a guy, and if the guy led, he'd punch him in the body. If the guy didn't lead, he'd drive him into the ropes, bully him out of the ring. Like he would force the guy to do something. But there are styles that would be tough for him. No one's invincible.
Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah, you're right. And I think that yeah, he just offers a tough type of style, and the power of matching it, as well as just the genetics. I think that kind of just put him in a different category or territory, if you want to say. Now, Poland Ball mentioned, I'd argue light heavyweight Langford was peak Sam. It seems like all of his best performances were around that weight, which, yeah,
Or
he had a
very
lot of
close
great
to it.
wins.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he would, when he was in fight shape, That's right, exactly, Poland. Yeah, when they put in the spongier gloves, he still battered him all over the ring. And Bill Lang, I love that fight because you see Bill Lang doing what you can see in the footage. Jack O'Brien, he's in that mode where you're sort of doing the side steps, so like, keeping your hands moving, then coming in to try and put damage on. The problem was when Bill Lang tried to plant his weight, Langford was absolutely happy to stand there and bang with him, and then Lang got right back on his bike. But yeah, Langford around 175, 180, 185 even, that was like his most dangerous weight. He had his full mobility. He was quick like a welterweight on his feet, but he hit like the heaviest of the heavyweight hitters. And he was very, how do you plan for a guy with those dimensions? It's just really tough. Guys find that today. Like, how do you plan for Tyson Fury? You're going to go find it. Just go find a random guy who's that big, who fights that well. There's only one, really, as far as that kind of these days. So Langford had that advantage. Even Rocky had that advantage. How do you prepare for Rocky? There's no one like him.
Yeah, right.
Calzaghe benefited from that. There's only one Joe Calzaghe. There's only one version of that style in its full expression. And actually, Joe Louis. Jack Blackburn had Joe Louis so perfectly tuned. No one's reached within the realm of that style of fighting. That's like the perfection of it when he was at his best.
And
now later, people see
a video where he was breaking down Joe Louis's punch style and how he was able to generate power and cut the ring off on opponents. Pretty amazing just thinking about it. He was highly skilled in that sense.
I remember that video. He had the chart and everything from an old publication to show the stance and why he stood the way he did and what it meant. Yeah. Keep your balance, the shuffling style. And that's the thing is, like, by the time... Okay, so look, I've seen an article in the early 1900s, they were saying the sport was almost 50 years old, right? Mm-hmm. Almost half a century old. By Joe Louis's era, now we're talking the 30s, Langford's era was considered the old timers. And the guys before that were like the old timers. They were ancient. So nothing's changed in a couple generations later. People start to forget. It's harder to forget nowadays. Sorry about the sirens. Some shit's going down over here, looks like, in the city.
It's no, good. I thought it was here at first because I hear more.
No, hold on a sec. I'll mute myself.
But no, good to go there. Random. So, yeah. Says Rocky had many incredible sneaky ways to enter. Though I don't think Sam could fully stop Rocky at hammering him around the ring.
It's quite possible. I wouldn't put it past Rocky. He was special. I just think that if you look at the way he comes in, right, his stance is actually similar to Langford's and Joe Louis's, but he's trying to navigate having very short arms. Langford was a master of range, and he had the power and the timing that was uncanny. There's something that people said about Ali's sense of range and distance was uncanny. That was said of Langford as well. I just think with Rocky, the way he was coming in to get close was exactly what Langford wanted opponents to do, which is get in close without a meaningful punch to lead. Because you see Rocky he pumps soft jabs and often has to walk through a lead punch to get in to land his own. You don't want to be walking through Langford punches. But again, I'm wrong a lot, and I don't want to disparage Rocky because he's one of the greats. He just doesn't have a resume where I rank him top 10 all time because I go by resume. But in ability and drive, absolute legend. I have the greatest respect. One of my favorite fighters. But I don't rank people based on how much I like or respect them. Like Calzaghe is literally my favorite boxer, but I don't put him amongst the all-time greats. Just the greats of that generation.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's
the resume.
A good way to go, considering, there were such vast differences back then. You're talking about guys fighting long 45-round fights, 20-plus round fights on the regular, which is, we're not going to see today. Now, Flag Boxing says lead elbow blocking while entering the pocket, the jab feint into the huge body uppercut, the cross into the clinch transitions, lead hook into the clinch transition. Yet Bert, as in I believe Bert Sugar said, Rocky has zero nuances. So this is in relation to Rocky Marciano.
It's tough. Bert Sugar, I think of him as a storyteller. He may have been a historian in his knowledge, but his presentation to the world was as a storyteller. And there's stuff that's overly generalized or straight up wrong, myth as fact and stuff. There's some I have some issues. I'm not going to diss the guy. He passed away, but definitely, I don't go, Bert Sugar said it, it's true, and I don't think anyone should. I think it'd be more like Bert Sugar brought it up. I should go look up and see what actually happened because it's
Oh yeah,
interesting. He
yeah,
presented, he was selling the sport, the myth of the sport, not necessarily in all, at least in sometimes he was just kind of relaying myth that sounded cool. But
yeah.
and Rocky was very nuanced. It's just that he was a plain spoken guy, so he wouldn't, the way he would describe his style wasn't as informed as the actual style itself. He was extremely intelligent. Are you kidding? A little dude like that, if he wasn't extremely, if he didn't have a high fight IQ, he would never have gotten anywhere in boxing because he had little arms fighting at heavyweight. It's not a
Oh yeah.
mistake that most guys with little arms like that have never had a good heavyweight career. That it's the exception rather than the rule because Rocky was special and he fought so brilliantly with what he had. Langford did the same. Langford was short, even though he had long arms, and he was hugely powerful. But being short is not good at heavyweight, where people have stopping power and range is important, including your height. And so Langford did the, people make the most with what they got. Not everyone's, you know, like Greb didn't sit down on his punches very much. He could stop guys if he wanted to at times, but staying light on his feet, weaponizing his cardio, volume, unpredictability, broken rhythm. Not everyone can fight the same way. Like I'll bring Calzaghe up again because I love to. Late in his career, his greatest performances, he did it with like ruined hands and like the Lacey fight, the masterclass. He had a wrist injury and he already had ruined hands, and he
Mm-hmm.
absolutely beat the prime out of the guy, out of an undefeated champion, rival champion. But he he might not have been able to plant down and stop Lacey even when he was wobbling because of the condition of his hands at that point in his career. He was fighting through pain all the time. So, different fighters find their own approach and they can be masterful in their own ways. Rocky didn't look too polished. And I think it was Sugar, or as you say, he was always off balance after he punched. It's not totally fair. It happened at times, but usually at the end of one Rocky punch was the beginning of another punch, which I love about his style. He'd finish the uppercut and the hook was coming from that position. He didn't go back to a neutral position in between punches, I guess is what I'm saying. Langford was like that himself when he wanted to be. He'd throw
Yeah.
the he'd throw to the body and then launch that same fist up the chest to the chin and then hit the left hook, or he'd feint low or hit the right straight to the body and then leaping left hook. Rocky used some of those same techniques. Although Rocky was taller, he had short arms. Langford was short with long arms, but they both used that gazelle punch technique brilliantly. So it's
Yeah.
definitely a big battle. Uh, I like Langford, but I would love to see it, and I wouldn't mind if I could get a time machine and Langford lost. I'd just
Mhm.
want to see the battle. To be honest, I mean these are two great fighters,
Yeah,
men of
yeah,
iron will.
yeah, I'm with you there. I think it would have been a great one. It would be good to see or whatever, had it happened or something like that. But yeah, Rocky, legit, and he trained in a way that was, they mentioned it was very intense. It was built for carrying power into longer distances as well. So he'd be able to stick around for sure. Yeah, so very intriguing matchup for sure. Poland Ball says Fitzsimmons he could not knock out Bill Lane in their 12 round fight, and Langford knocked him silly. That's how strong Langford was. He could hurt almost any all time great, which, yeah, I agree with for sure.
Yeah, that's what the other heavyweights of his era and the one after, and like guys like Jack Blackburn, like everyone knew that he could hit. Like Fitz could also hit, but Langford like had a lot more fights and fought a lot more times, at heavyweight. So like Langford was a special case now, and it's not like comparing him to other great hitters like Ernie Shavers or even Wilder. People call him a great, hitter. They certainly win-loss record and knockout numbers, but you know, Langford wasn't a big guy and didn't have a long frame. He had big arms, but he didn't have a long frame to generate that power. But he had timing and technique, and he had been trained by champions, Bob Armstrong and George Byers. These guys were serious dudes themselves. And Byers, especially, was a middleweight who fought and even captured the heavyweight colored title at one point. So these guys knew what they were doing, and Langford learned to get the absolute most out of his frame. And those punches, if a great fighter like Harry Wills is like, he hits so hard, you don't even feel it. Jim Flynn said that too. He said the strangest thing, it didn't even hurt. He hit so hard, it didn't even hurt.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and Flynn went longer with Johnson across their 2 fights. The first time he fought Langford, he just got demolished in 1908, just blown out. Like it wasn't even the beginnings of a competitive fight. And that's how hard Langford hit, because Jim Flynn's style was to come forward and battle. And like I was saying with other boxers throughout history, if you just want to come in on Langford, it's a bad night, because he's coming at you, and he's not the one who's going to back off, because he'll trade, and he hits harder than everybody. So if you trade, it's just like there are probably other guys like, do you want to get into a firefight with prime Mike Tyson? Like, I'm just going to stand in the pocket and bang it out with Mike. What could go wrong? No, man, if you want it, you better tie him up, or you better jab him and move, or you better do something. Don't just sit there and eat some Mike Tyson in his best. Same with Rocky. Who goes in there and just be like, yo, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get real close to Rocky Marciano. I'm going to just tear him up to the body. It's going to be great. He doesn't have a chance. No, that's a great way to get rib damage and bruised organs. Langford was like that. He was feared.
Easier said than done, for sure. Definitely that. Now, Random Blake Gallimore says, Josh, who are your top 5 pound for pound fighters all time? Yeah, that's hard. There's so many great fighters. I haven't really fully created a list, but I know that I would certainly have, for me, I would have Langford, Ali, Henry Armstrong, Harry Greb, and then probably Ray Robinson right there. But yeah, there's really no wrong way to go, I guess you can say. But yeah, at that top elite level, a lot of great boxers who, at varying points in their career, were considered the best in the world, and some even the best ever for the people of that time who could recollect on seeing these types of individuals fight. The ones that, of course, who had long died prior to where we are now, as far as when they started their careers and everything. So it's very interesting top 5 wise, but I know Random, I know you have some listing, maybe your thoughts behind who you rate in that top 5.
Yeah, it's tough. Like, my top 4 is solid, although the orders, I'm still not set on it. But for me, for their poundage, literally for their poundage, for the pounds of their body, the greatest to me of all time: Sam Langford, Harry Greb, Sugar Ray Robinson, Hammer and Hank Armstrong. Just to me, those are the 4 proven through resume for their pounds, relative to their own size, factoring their resume, their proven ability, not the eye test. Because the eye test, just like, look at Lomachenko's eye test, and then he fights Lopez, and now you got to refactor it because the guy beat him with a stiff jab, and he didn't adjust quickly enough. So it's like, before then, if you'd said, yo, this guy's going to come in and take the center of the ring and just jab him for 6 rounds and take the decision, and Loma's just going to keep doing what he's doing for 6 rounds in a row, you'd be like, you're crazy, dude. Matrix, man. Matrix. He's going to block him with the forearms. He's going to step to the side. He's going to hit him with this. He didn't do any of that because of the way his opponent approached the fight and fought a very good, smart fight, a very intelligent fight. Just like Joshua in the rematch with Ruiz, although he looked kind of gangly, he looked a little awkward doing it, but he stuck behind the jab. Mostly was disciplined. He only got into that clinch a couple times, only ate a few bombs that way, won the fight with game plan. So game plan has a lot to do. Fight IQ. Sam had a very high fight IQ, even when he was old and blind and fat. So James Toney had a high fight IQ. You don't see him making a lot of stupid moves in the middle of a fight. That's how he can be literally just right up next to the guy. He's chilling. He's in mortal danger, and he's just totally calm, collected. He knows where he is. He knows what can happen from every angle. Guys like that, you got to look out for, even when they're old. Hopkins was like that. His understanding of what it took to win a boxing match was so high that he was competitive into his 50s. That's crazy shit.
Yeah, it is. It is. Thinking about Hopkins in that way, yeah, certainly pretty crazy to think he was at like 50 doing this thing, still at the top of his game. Boxing
to me, one of the greats of that generation, one of the great modern era greats to me. Not my favorite fighter to watch or to celebrate, but Hopkins to me is one of the greats for sure.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. And Flag Boxing says round 16 of Greb versus Walker is my favorite story, though. Yeah, I'd imagine that was a hell of a fight. That's one I wish we had video of, as far as getting any form of grab video, I think that Walker fight would be a great one. That and the Tunney fight the first time around, even though that was Greb who had a considerable amount of wear and tear behind him and everything of that nature.
Yo,
So
by round 16, he means the brawl, the bar brawl. They
yeah,
fought 15, right? Yeah. Oh,
yeah, I guess
I think
that
he
may
means
be
yeah.
the case.
They had a little extra round there at the end, drinking.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I heard. Yeah, I remember reading
Yeah,
or
there was
hearing
some
about
rough and tumble guys. Those are some
that.
rough and tumble. Because people say about like rule breaking and stuff like that, and like it gets hung on Greb a lot. Because certainly toward the end of his career, when he was losing sight, when he took more liberties, but lots of guys did. It was a rougher time. And like you go back to Langford's era, when certain jurisdictions you could kidney punch, you could rabbit punch too. It wasn't always prohibited by every ref. So those are also factors. So if you, like we were saying earlier, so if you say you take Mayweather back and you fight a lightweight Sam Langford, but Langford's allowed to kidney punch and rabbit punch, maybe he does win the fight because maybe the Philly shell isn't as effective if you get clubbed in the back of your dome. Just a thought.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I think yeah, legit one, a good one. Yeah, with that, and
Similarly, certain tools that were available to some guys that would help them wouldn't be available in the modern era, or the bigger gloves would make it harder for certain things to translate. So that would make a difference in a fantasy matchup. Who's going to whose era?
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That's yeah,
Like, is
yeah.
Rocky
That's
going
why
to
it's
go
hard.
fight 45 rounds against Langford in
Yeah,
California in 1910? Is he going to fight 45 rounds in the sun? I don't know.
yeah. That's where things change and it starts to get complicated because it was just so different back then. That's where
Yeah.
boxing
Although I
says
think
Sam
Rocky would
Langford.
have been great in any era. I think
Oh
Rocky
yeah,
is one of those standout, driven individuals who would have always been great. He would always been someone who found a way.
yeah, very much, very much. I think that is the case. Yeah, a lot of those guys who are top level in modern times, yeah, would have likely been contenders back in the day in some sense. Now, Scrapbook Boxing mentioned Sam Langford was a testament of his profession. Great conversation, gentlemen. Thank you, Scrapbook. Appreciate you being in here. Certainly love to talk Langford, a fighter who definitely deserves his just due credit, and that's what we try to do. Flat Boxing says I need to have Random more often, unbiased knowledge, without a doubt. I'm going to see if I can get Random more often, doing more
Oh,
of the
thanks, Flack.
history.
I appreciate that. It means a lot. Yeah, and Josh, I'd be happy to come on, man. I love talking boxing with you because you like today's stuff, but you are someone who appreciates the old school. And Scrap, I'm just thrilled, Scrapbook, to have had any association with you, my friend. You're an absolute treasure to the community.
Yeah,
Such
but
it's such a pleasure, and I'm excited. I know we haven't scheduled the actual day, but this top five rivalries that me, you, Josh, and BL are doing, top five rivalries in boxing. I wanted to mention to you, it's okay to have tie places. There have been
no,
too
yeah,
many great rivalries. It's okay to have tie places because none of us probably can restrict it to simply five rivalries. That's really
yeah,
tough.
certainly hard and tough to get to that point, without a doubt. And
I'd
yeah,
have trouble picking Sam Langford's top five rivalries, let alone everybody's of all time. Come on now.
yeah, yeah, right,
I
yeah,
gotta have
yeah.
ties in there. I gotta have a lot of ties. I'll be honest.
Oh yeah, makes it super interesting for sure. Now, Flat Boxing says Walker apparently pulled Grab's coat over his head and knocked him out cold. I love the personality of Walker, especially if it's a fake story. It shows the personality of Walker's 20s street mentality. Yeah, I think that. Yeah, that certainly does. He was a tough guy, tough warrior there, Mickey Walker. He would bang it out with anyone, and that's something I always mention is just like crazy. It's kind of cool seeing him in there fighting
Yeah,
Sharky
he
and
was a tough
Smelling, which is
cookie.
the videos that we have. Even though Smelling knocked him out, but Walker, he was fearless in the sense that he jumped up there and was willing to take on all comers. You know what I'm saying? Just from that standpoint, whenever he continued to rise in weight.
Oh, good night, Doug. Thanks for coming through, brother.
Yeah,
Yeah,
salute Doug.
Walker was a tough cookie. I mean, there were a lot of this. It's hard for us to conceive of today how tough life in general was for working class people in those days, and then how much tougher than regular working class people the boxers were, and like the real level of what they could put up with because what the alternatives were for their life. You know, because today, if you don't like boxing, you can go get middle class money doing a job, especially if you grab some overtime. You can get health care. You can do, you know, these guys didn't have any kind of safety net like this. This is before, you know, FDR's thing. So like there was nothing. You know, you could die in poverty, or you can hope that your fellow boxers will do a charity event for you. Langford had a couple of those. Langford also participated in some for others.
Oh
In fact,
yeah.
Langford he boxed just days after he lost to Jack Johnson. He actually did a short exhibition against him for a benefit for the victims of San Francisco earthquake. It was an earthquake or a fire. I think it was an earthquake, but there's actually a famous photo of Langford standing next to Johnson. And Joe Woodman's there, and Langford, you can see he's got a big old shiner on one eye. One of his cheeks is all swollen up, and I think it's from that benefit.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. In all
And he's kind of
likelihood.
looking up at Johnson and smiling, you know, and like, but like, so even though they had a rivalry, they did respect each other. They respected each other's ability. So it wasn't that they, like, Johnson wasn't like, oh, I beat him in '06. He sucks. Like, everyone knew how choice that matchup was. It didn't work out, partly through Johnson's fault, but partly also because circumstances overtook Johnson when he started being persecuted by the US government. Things got
Oh
very
yeah.
complicated for him. And this, so, you know, the real window for that fight to happen was like in 1909 or 1910. Once he'd had the super fight with Jeffries and they had the race riots and all this stuff, you know, the general public and politicians got on board with all this racial tension. That changed the equation. He could have still had the fight. He got offers in Australia and Paris and all kinds of places, all kinds of people, London, all kinds of people wanted to promote the fight, but it wasn't entirely on Johnson. I don't want to be unfair to him. The larger swirling tensions in society overtook him before too long. So it was complicated. And he also had a really hard life. So if,
Oh
you
yeah.
know, I love sports, but I'm also a realist. And if guys want to go for the money instead of having the toughest adversity, I'm okay with it. I just don't give credit for money when I talk about legacy. I'm just talking about fighting, martial arts, sport competition. So, you know, that's why with Johnson, like if he had fought, you know, he'd be the greatest ever, hands down. If he had fought all those great contemporaries once they hit their primes, and because he would have beaten 2 full generations of greats, well, almost 3. But he didn't. He backed it off a little bit toward the end. So it's just how it goes.
Yeah.
It's
But
all
he's
good. We have some
perfect.
heavyweights today who seem to be backing it off toward the end of their careers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, you know, taking fights that are credible, but they're not really like top fights. Some of the guys, you're like, come on, you need to fight that guy. You don't need to fight him.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Without a doubt. I think you make a very, very great point there. And then Poland Ball says, "Hey, at 86 boxing off topic, but have you thought about making a Jimmy Berry video? He was a bantamweight champion in the 1890s and was 59-0. You know, I remember the name, but yeah, I need to study up on him for sure. That is one that yeah, I think I want to do, or I will do it. So Jimmy Berry, that's one to keep in mind, and I'll get an opportunity to see exactly how his career went and everything. So always down to do videos on some of these great fighters who were able to, you know, stand out amongst tough and heavy competition as far as their era in their day and all that stuff. And so yeah, with that random in terms of yeah, we've been going a good minute. We're a little over an hour and a half, and
Two and a
yeah, I
half.
know that we could probably
That's how we
wrap
roll
things
here.
up.
That's how
That's
we
how we
do.
roll. So you know what? I think it warrants a second discussion. So for everyone in, and we do appreciate everyone and who's watching it to come. Yeah, maybe me and Random will set up something where we can talk about a little bit more in terms of Sam Langford in his career and have some other areas that we could touch on. So
Yeah, I'd love to.
definitely,
It'd be interesting to highlight his various rivalries, you know, or maybe the dozen top rivalries. I mean, let me tell you, people, this guy had, so they used to joke about keeping stats, you know, like ball sports. He had so many rivalries, and some of them were incredibly long and maybe not more known than the other ones. But that might be a good topic for a panel discussion.
yeah,
Sam
you're right.
Langford's although his top 5 rivalries would be easier to pick than just highlighting all of them, because it would be the Hall of Fame guys that he fought a billion times each.
Oh yeah.
We'll
I can
see.
already think of some of them for sure. So yeah, I think that would be a very good topic. So yeah, we'll have to try and set some stuff up. But yeah, great question, Pole and Ball. But yeah, so Random, yeah, definitely been a pleasure having you on discussing the great Sam Langford. And that's one of the reasons I certainly wanted you to be on to share all this vast knowledge and some of these nuggets that a lot of people might not know about as it relates to his career. So we're definitely going to do it again. Everyone definitely follow Random Acoustic Thoughts at Random Acoustic Thoughts here on YouTube. And he is someone that will keep you up to date, in tune, and in depth on the great Langford and a number of the other great heavyweights of that time. And I think, yeah, Random, keep it up without a doubt. I look forward to having you on again.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And shout out to the chat and everyone listening after the fact. Thanks, y'all. And yeah, let's talk in the back, Josh. We'll figure out a time to do a little part 2 here. Why not?
Oh yeah, without a doubt. So yeah, thanks everyone for jumping in the mix, tuning in with us. More to come for sure. More to come. Have a good one.